Chapter 19 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 19. 2 Letters. It was toward the latter part of June that the letter came to Pollyanna from Della Weatherby. "I am writing to ask you a favor," Miss Weatherby wrote. "I am hoping you can tell me of some quiet, private family in Beldingsville that will be willing to take my sister to board for the summer. There would be 3 of them, Mrs. Carew, her secretary, and her adopted son, Jamie. You remember Jamie, don't you? They do not like to go to an ordinary hotel or boarding house. My sister is very tired, and the doctor has advised her to go into the country for a complete rest and change. He suggested Vermont or New Hampshire. We immediately thought of Beldingsville and you, and we wondered if you couldn't recommend just the right place to us. I told Ruth I would write you. They would like to go right away, early in July, if possible. Would it be asking too much to request you to let us know as soon as you conveniently can if you do know of a place? Please address me here. My sister is with us here at the sanatorium for a few weeks' treatment. Hoping for a favorable reply, I am most cordially yours, Della Weatherby." For the first few minutes after the letter was finished, Pollyanna sat with frowning brow, mentally searching the homes of Beldingsville for a possible boarding house for her old friends. Then a sudden something gave her thoughts a new turn, and with a joyous exclamation she hurried to her aunt in the living room. "Auntie, Auntie," she panted, "I've got just the loveliest idea. I told you something would happen, and that I'd develop that wonderful talent sometime. Well, I have right now. Listen. I've had a letter from Miss Weatherby, Mrs. Carew's sister, where I stayed that winter in Boston, you know, and they want to come into the country to board for the summer, and Miss Weatherby's written to see if I didn't know a place for them. They don't want a hotel or an ordinary boarding house, you see, and at first I didn't know of one. But now I do. I do, Aunt Polly. Just guess where 'tis." "Dear me, child," ejaculated Mrs. Chilton, "how you do run on! I should think you were a dozen years old instead of a woman grown. Now what are you talking about?" "About a boarding place for Mrs. Carew and Jamie. I've found it," babbled Pollyanna. "Indeed? Well, what of it? Of what possible interest can that be to me, child?" murmured Mrs. Chilton drearily. "Because it's here. I'm going to have them here, Auntie." "Pollyanna!" Mrs. Chilton was sitting erect in horror. "Now, Auntie, please don't say no. Please don't," begged Pollyanna eagerly. "Don't you see? This is my chance. The chance I've been waiting for, and it's just dropped right into my hands. We can do it lovely. We have plenty of room, and you know I can cook and keep house. And now there'd be money in it, for they'd pay well, I know, and they'd love to come, I'm sure. There'd be 3 of them. There's a secretary with them." "But, Pollyanna, I can't. Turn this house into a boarding house? The Harrington homestead a common boarding house? Oh, Pollyanna, I can't. I can't." "But it wouldn't be a common boarding house, dear. 'Twill be an uncommon one. Besides, they're our friends. It would be like having our friends come to see us, only they'd be paying guests. So meanwhile we'd be earning money. Money that we need, Auntie. Money that we need," she emphasized significantly. A spasm of hurt pride crossed Polly Chilton's face, With a low moan, she fell back in her chair. "But how could you do it?" she asked at last, faintly. "You couldn't do the work part alone, child." "Oh, no, of course not," chirped Pollyanna. Pollyanna was on sure ground now. She knew her point was won. "But I could do the cooking and the overseeing, and I'm sure I could get one of Nancy's younger sisters to help about the rest. Mrs. Durgin would do the laundry part, just as she does now." "But, Pollyanna, I'm not well at all. You know I'm not. I couldn't do much." "Of course not. There's no reason why you should," scorned Pollyanna, loftily. "Oh, Auntie, won't it be splendid? Why, it seems too good to be true. Money just dropped into my hands like that." "Dropped into your hands, indeed! You still have some things to learn in this world, Pollyanna, and one is that summer boarders don't drop money into anybody's hands without looking very sharply to it that they get ample return. By the time you fetch and carry and bake and brew until you are ready to sink, and by the time you nearly kill yourself trying to serve everything to order from fresh-laid eggs to the weather, you will believe what I tell you." "All right, I'll remember," laughed Pollyanna. "But I'm not doing any worrying now, and I'm going to hurry and write Miss Wetherby at once, so I can give it to Jimmy Bean to mail when he comes out this afternoon." Mrs. Chilton stirred restlessly. "Pollyanna, I do wish you'd call that young man by his proper name. That Bean gives me the shivers. His name is Pendleton now, as I understand it." "So it is," agreed Pollyanna, "but I do forget it half the time. I even call him that to his face sometimes, and of course that's dreadful, when he really is adopted and all. But you see, I'm so excited," she finished, as she danced from the room. She had the letter all ready for Jimmy when he called at 4 o'clock. She was still quivering with excitement, and she lost no time in telling her visitor what it was all about. "And I'm crazy to see them besides," she cried, when she had told him of her plans. "I've never seen either of them since that winter. You know I told you, didn't I tell you about Jamie?" "Oh, yes, you told me." There was a touch of constraint in the young man's voice. "Well, isn't it splendid if they can come?" "Why, I don't know as I should call it exactly splendid," he parried. "Not splendid that I've got such a chance to help Aunt Polly out for even this little while? Why, Jimmy, of course it's splendid." "Well, it strikes me that it's going to be rather hard for you," bridled Jimmy, with more than a shade of irritation. "Yes, of course, in some ways. But I shall be so glad for the money coming in that I'll think of that all the time. You see," she sighed, "how mercenary I am, Jimmy." For a long minute there was no reply. Then, a little abruptly, the young man asked, "Let's see, how old is this Jamie now?" Pollyanna glanced up with a merry smile. "Oh, I remember. You never did like his name, Jamie," she twinkled. "Never mind. He's adopted now, legally, I believe, and has taken the name of Carew, so you can call him that." "But that isn't telling me how old he is," reminded Jimmy stiffly. "Nobody knows exactly, I suppose. You know he couldn't tell. But I imagine he's about your age. I wonder how he is now. I've asked all about it in this letter, anyway." "Oh, you have?" Pendleton looked down at the letter in his hand and flipped it a little spitefully. He was thinking that he would like to drop it, to tear it up, to give it to somebody, to throw it away, to do anything with it but mail it. Jimmy knew perfectly well that he was jealous, that he always had been jealous of this youth with the name so like and yet so unlike his own. Not that he was in love with Pollyanna, he assured himself wrathfully. He was not that, of course. It was just that he did not care to have this strange youth with the sissy name come to Beldingsville and be always around to spoil all their good times. He almost said as much to Pollyanna, but something stayed the words on his lips, and after a time he took his leave, carrying the letter with him. That Jimmy did not drop the letter, tear it up, give it to anybody, or throw it away was evidenced a few days later, for Pollyanna received a prompt and delighted reply from Miss Wetherby. And when Jimmy came next time, he heard it read, or rather, he heard part of it, for Pollyanna prefaced the reading by saying, "Of course, the first part is just where she says how glad they are to come and all that. I won't read that. But the rest I thought you'd like to hear, because you've heard me talk so much about them. Besides, you'll know them yourself pretty soon, of course. I'm depending a whole lot on you, Jimmy, to help me make it pleasant for them." "Oh, you are?" "Now, don't be sarcastic just because you don't like Jamie's name," reproved Pollyanna, with mock severity. "You'll like him, I'm sure, when you know him, and you'll love Mrs. Carew." "Will I, indeed?" retorted Jimmy huffily. "Well, that is a serious prospect. Let us hope, if I do, the lady will be so gracious as to reciprocate." "Of course," dimpled Pollyanna. "Now listen, and I'll read to you about her. This letter is from her sister Della, Miss Wetherby, you know, at the sanatorium." "All right, go ahead," directed Jimmy, with a somewhat too evident attempt at polite interest. And Pollyanna, still smiling mischievously, began to read. "You asked me to tell you everything about everybody. That is a large commission, but I'll do the best I can. To begin with, I think you'll find my sister quite changed. The new interests that have come into her life during the last 6 years have done wonders for her. Just now she is a bit thin and tired from overwork, but a good rest will soon remedy that, and you'll see how young and blooming and happy she looks. Please notice I said happy. That won't mean so much to you as it does to me, of course, for you were too young to realize quite how unhappy she was when you first knew her that winter in Boston. Life was such a dreary, hopeless thing to her then, and now it is so full of interest and joy. First, she has Jamie, and when you see them together you won't need to be told what he is to her. To be sure, we are no nearer knowing whether he is the real Jamie or not, but my sister loves him like an own son now and has legally adopted him, as I presume you know. Then she has her girls. Do you remember Sadie Dean, the salesgirl? Well, from getting interested in her and trying to help her to a happier living, my sister has broadened her efforts little by little until she has scores of girls now who regard her as their own best and particular good angel. She has started a home for working girls along new lines. Half a dozen wealthy and influential men and women are associated with her, of course, but she is head and shoulders of the whole thing, and never hesitates to give herself to each and every one of the girls. You can imagine what that means in nerve strain. Her chief support and right-hand man is her secretary, this same Sadie Dean. You'll find her changed, too, yet she is the same old Sadie. As for Jamie, poor Jamie, the great sorrow of his life is that he knows now he can never walk. For a time we all had hopes. He was here at the sanatorium under Dr. Ames for a year, and he improved to such an extent that he can go now with crutches. But the poor boy will always be a cripple so far as his feet are concerned, but never as regards anything else. Some way, after you know Jamie, you seldom think of him as a cripple. His soul is so free. I can't explain it, but you'll know what I mean when you see him. And he has retained, to a marvelous degree, his old boyish enthusiasm and joy for living. There is just one thing, and only one, I believe, that would utterly quench that bright spirit and cast him into utter despair. And that is to find that he is not Jamie Kent, our nephew. So long has he brooded over this, and so ardently has he wished it, that he has come actually to believe that he is the real Jamie. But if he isn't, I hope he will never find it out. "There, that's all she says about them," announced Pollyanna, folding up the closely written sheets in her hands. "But isn't that interesting?" "Indeed it is." There was a ring of genuineness in Jimmy's voice now. Jimmy was thinking suddenly of what his own good legs meant to him. He even, for the moment, was willing that this poor crippled youth should have a part of Pollyanna's thoughts and attentions, if he were not so presuming as to claim too much of them, of course. By George, it is tough for the poor chap, and no mistake. "Tough? You don't know anything about it, Jimmy Bean," choked Pollyanna. "But I do. I couldn't walk once. I know." "Yes, of course, frowned the youth, moving restively in his seat. Jimmy, looking into Pollyanna's sympathetic face and brimming eyes, was suddenly not so sure, after all, that he was willing to have this Jamie come to town, if just to think of him made Pollyanna look like that. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 20. The Paying Guests. The few intervening days before the expected arrival of "those dreadful people," as Aunt Polly termed her niece's paying guests, were busy ones indeed for Pollyanna, but they were happy ones, too, as Pollyanna refused to be weary or discouraged or dismayed, no matter how puzzling were the daily problems she had to meet. Summoning Nancy and Nancy's younger sister Betty to her aid, Pollyanna systematically went through the house room by room and arranged for the comfort and convenience of her expected boarders. Mrs. Chilton could do but little to assist. In the first place, she was not well. In the second place, her mental attitude toward the whole idea was not conducive to aid or comfort. For at her side stalked always the Harrington pride of name and race, and on her lips was the constant moan, "Oh, Pollyanna, Pollyanna, to think of the Harrington homestead ever coming to this!" "It isn't, dearie," Pollyanna at last soothed laughingly. "It's the Carews that are coming to the Harrington homestead." But Mrs. Chilton was not to be so lightly diverted, and responded only with a scornful glance and a deeper sigh, so Pollyanna was forced to leave her to travel alone her road of determined gloom. Upon the appointed day, Pollyanna, with Timothy, who owned the Harrington horses now, went to the station to meet the afternoon train. Up to this hour there had been nothing but confidence and joyous anticipation in Pollyanna's heart. But with the whistle of the engine there came to her a veritable panic of doubt, shyness, and dismay. She realized suddenly what she, Pollyanna, almost alone and unaided, was about to do. She remembered Mrs. Carew's wealth, position, and fastidious tastes. She recollected, too, that this would be a new, tall, young man Jamie, quite unlike the boys she had known. For one awful moment she thought only of getting away, somewhere, anywhere. "Timothy, I feel sick. I'm not well. Tell 'em not to come," she faltered, poising as if for flight. "Ma'am?" exclaimed the startled Timothy. One glance into Timothy's amazed face was enough. Pollyanna laughed and threw back her shoulders alertly. "Nothing. Never mind. I didn't mean it, of course, Timothy. Quick, see, they're almost here," she panted. And Pollyanna hurried forward quite herself once more. She knew them at once. Even had there been any doubt in her mind, the crutches in the hands of the tall, brown-eyed young man would have piloted her straight to her goal. There were a brief few minutes of eager hand-clasps and incoherent exclamations. Then somehow she found herself in the carriage with Mrs. Carew at her side, and Jamie and Sadie Dean in front. She had a chance then, for the first time, really to see her friends, and to note the changes the 6 years had wrought. In regard to Mrs. Carew, her first feeling was one of surprise. She had forgotten that Mrs. Carew was so lovely. She had forgotten that the eyelashes were so long, that the eyes they shaded were so beautiful. She even caught herself thinking enviously of how exactly that perfect face must tally, figure by figure, with that dread beauty test table. But more than anything else she rejoiced in the absence of the old fretful lines of gloom and bitterness. Then she turned to Jamie. Here again she was surprised, and for much the same reason. Jamie, too, had grown handsome. To herself, Pollyanna declared that he was really distinguished-looking. His dark eyes, rather pale face, and dark, waving hair she thought most attractive. Then she caught a glimpse of the crutches at his side, and a spasm of aching sympathy contracted her throat. From Jamie, Pollyanna turned to Sadie Dean. Sadie, so far as features went, looked much as she had when Pollyanna first saw her in the Public Garden. But Pollyanna did not need a second glance to know that Sadie, so far as hair, dress, temper, speech, and disposition were concerned, was a very different Sadie indeed. Then Jamie spoke. "How good you were to let us come," he said to Pollyanna. "Do you know what I thought of when you wrote that we could come?" "Why, no, of course not," stammered Pollyanna. Pollyanna was still seeing the crutches at Jamie's side, and her throat was still tightened from that aching sympathy. "Well, I thought of the little maid in the Public Garden with her bag of peanuts for Sir Lancelot, and I knew that you were just putting us in their places. For if you had a bag of peanuts and we had none, you wouldn't be happy till you'd shared it with us." "A bag of peanuts, indeed!" laughed Pollyanna. "Oh, of course, in this case your bag of peanuts happened to be airy country rooms, and cow's milk, and real eggs from a real hen's nest," returned Jamie whimsically. "But it amounts to the same thing. And maybe I'd better warn you. You remember how greedy Sir Lancelot was. Well," he paused meaningly. "All right, I'll take the risk," dimpled Pollyanna, thinking how glad she was that Aunt Polly was not present to hear her worst predictions so nearly fulfilled this early. "Poor Sir Lancelot! I wonder if anybody feeds him now, or if he's there at all." "Well, if he's there, he's fed," interposed Mrs. Carew merrily. "This ridiculous boy still goes down there at least once a week with his pockets bulging with peanuts, and I don't know what all. He can be traced any time by the trail of small grains he leaves behind him, and half the time, when I order my cereal for breakfast, it isn't forthcoming because, forsooth, Master Jamie has fed it to the pigeons, ma'am." "Yes, but let me tell you," plunged in Jamie enthusiastically. And the next minute Pollyanna found herself listening with all the old fascination to a story of a couple of squirrels in a sunlit garden. Later she saw what Della Wetherby had meant in her letter, for when the house was reached, it came as a distinct shock to her to see Jamie pick up his crutches and swing himself out of the carriage with their aid. She knew then that already in 10 short minutes he had made her forget that he was lame. To Pollyanna's great relief, that first dreaded meeting between Aunt Polly and the Carew party passed off much better than she had feared. The newcomers were so frankly delighted with the old house and everything in it that it was an utter impossibility for the mistress and owner of it all to continue her stiff attitude of disapproving resignation to their presence. Besides, as was plainly evident before an hour had passed, the personal charm and magnetism of Jamie had pierced even Aunt Polly's armor of distrust, and Pollyanna knew that at least one of her most dreaded problems was a problem no longer. For already Aunt Polly was beginning to play the stately yet gracious hostess to these her guests. Notwithstanding her relief at Aunt Polly's change of attitude, however, Pollyanna did not find that all was smooth sailing by any means. There was work, and plenty of it, that must be done. Nancy's sister, Betty, was pleasant and willing, but she was not Nancy, as Pollyanna soon found. She needed training, and training took time. Pollyanna worried, too, for fear everything should not be quite right. To Pollyanna, those days, a dusty chair was a crime, and a fallen cake a tragedy. Gradually, however, after incessant arguments and pleadings on the part of Mrs. Carew and Jamie, Pollyanna came to take her tasks more easily, and to realize that the real crime and tragedy in her friend's eyes was not the dusty chair, nor the fallen cake, but the frown of worry and anxiety on her own face. "Just as if it wasn't enough for you to let us come," Jamie declared, "without just killing yourself with work to get us something to eat. Besides, we ought not to eat so much anyway," Mrs. Carew laughed, "or else we shall get digestion, as one of my girls calls it when her food disagrees with her." It was wonderful, after all, how easily the three new members of the family fitted into the daily life. Before 24 hours had passed, Mrs. Carew had gotten Mrs. Chilton to asking really interested questions about the new home for working girls, and Sadie Dean and Jamie were quarreling over the chance to help with the pea shelling or the flower picking. The Carews had been at the Harrington homestead nearly a week when one evening John Pendleton and Jimmy called. Pollyanna had been hoping they would come soon. She had indeed urged it very strongly before the Carews came. She made the introductions now with visible pride. "You are such good friends of mine. I want you to know each other and be good friends together," she explained. That Jimmy and Mr. Pendleton should be clearly impressed with the charm and beauty of Mrs. Carew did not surprise Pollyanna in the least. But the look that came into Mrs. Carew's face at sight of Jimmy did surprise her very much. It was almost a look of recognition. "Why, Mr. Pendleton, haven't I met you before?" Mrs. Carew cried. Jimmy's frank eyes met Mrs. Carew's gaze squarely, admiringly. "I think not," he smiled back at her. "I'm sure I never have met you. I should have remembered it if I had met you," he bowed. So unmistakable was his significant emphasis that everybody laughed, and John Pendleton chuckled. "Well done, son, for a youth of your tender years. I couldn't have done half so well myself." Mrs. Carew flushed slightly and joined in the laugh. "No, but really," she urged, "joking aside, there certainly is a strangely familiar something in your face. I think I must have seen you somewhere, if I haven't actually met you." "And maybe you have," cried Pollyanna. "In Boston. Jimmy goes to Tech there winters, you know. Jimmy's going to build bridges and dams, you see, when he grows up, I mean," she finished with a merry glance at the big 6-foot fellow still standing before Mrs. Carew. Everybody laughed again. That is, everybody but Jamie. And only Sadie Dean noticed that Jamie, instead of laughing, closed his eyes as if at the sight of something that hurt. and only Sadie Dean knew how and why the subject was so quickly changed. For it was Sadie herself who changed it. It was Sadie, too, who, when the opportunity came, saw to it that books and flowers and beasts and birds, things that Jamie knew and understood, were talked about, as well as dams and bridges, which, as Sadie knew, Jamie could never build. That Sadie did all this, however, was not realized by anybody, least of all by Jamie, the one who most of all was concerned. When the call was over and the Pendletons had gone, Mrs. Carew referred again to the curiously haunting feeling that somewhere she had seen young Pendleton before. I know I have somewhere," she declared musingly. "Of course, it may have been in Boston, but—" She let the sentence remain unfinished. Then, after a minute, she added, "He's a fine young fellow, anyway. I like him." "I'm so glad. I do, too," nodded Pollyanna. "I've always liked Jimmy." "You've known him some time, then?" queried Jamie, a little wistfully. "Oh, yes. I knew him years ago, when I was a little girl, you know. He was Jimmy Bean then." "Jimmy Bean? Why, isn't he Mr. Pendleton's son?" asked Mrs. Carew in surprise. "No, only by adoption." "Adoption!" exclaimed Jamie. "Then he isn't a real son any more than I am." There was a curious note of almost joy in the lad's voice. "No, Mr. Pendleton hasn't any children. He never married. He was going to once, but he didn't." Pollyanna blushed and spoke with such diffidence. Pollyanna had never forgotten that it was her mother who, in the long ago, had said no to this same John Pendleton, and who had thus been responsible for the man's long, lonely years of bachelorhood. Mrs. Carew and Jamie, however, being unaware of this, and seeing now only the blush on Pollyanna's cheek and the diffidence in her manner, drew suddenly the same conclusion. Is it possible, they asked themselves, that this man, John Pendleton, ever had a love affair with Pollyanna, child that she is? Naturally, they did not say this aloud, so naturally there was no answer possible. Naturally, too, perhaps, the thought, though unspoken, was still not forgotten, but was tucked away in a corner of their minds for future reference, if need arose. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 21. Summer Days. Before the Carews came, Pollyanna had told Jimmy that she was depending on him to help her entertain them. Jimmy had not expressed himself then as being overwhelmingly desirous to serve her in this way, but before the Carews had been in town a fortnight, he had shown himself as not only willing but anxious, judging by the frequency and length of his calls and the lavishness of his offers of the Pendleton horses and motor cars. Between him and Mrs. Carew there sprang up at once a warm friendship based on what seemed to be a peculiarly strong attraction for each other. They walked and talked together, and even made sundry plans for the home for working girls to be carried out the following winter, when Jimmy should be in Boston. Jamie, too, came in for a good measure of attention. Nor was Sadie Dean forgotten. Sadie, as Mrs. Carew plainly showed, was to be regarded as if she were quite one of the family, and Mrs. Carew was careful to see that she had full share in any plans for merrymaking. Nor did Jimmy always come alone with his offers for entertainment. More and more frequently John Pendleton appeared with him. Rides and drives and picnics were planned and carried out, and long, delightful afternoons were spent over books and fancy work on the Harrington veranda. Pollyanna was delighted. Not only were her paying guests being kept from any possibilities of ennui and homesickness, but her good friends, the Carews, were becoming delightfully acquainted with her other good friends, the Pendletons. So like a mother hen with a brood of chicks, she hovered over the veranda meetings and did everything in her power to keep the group together and happy. Neither the Carews nor the Pendletons, however, were at all satisfied to have Pollyanna merely an onlooker in their pastimes, and very strenuously they urged her to join them. They would not take no for an answer, indeed, and Pollyanna very frequently found the way open for her. "Just as if we were going to have you poked up in this hot kitchen frosting cake," Jamie scolded one day after he had penetrated the fastnesses of her domain. "It is a perfectly glorious morning, and we're all going over to the gorge and take our luncheon, and you are going with us." "But, Jamie, I can't. Indeed I can't," refused Pollyanna. "Why not? You won't have dinner to get for us, for we shan't be here to eat it." "But there's the luncheon." "Wrong again. We'll have the luncheon with us, so you can't stay home to get that. Now what's to hinder you from going along with the luncheon, eh?" "Why, Jamie, I can't. There's the cake to frost." "Don't want it frosted." "And the dusting." "Don't want it dusted." "And the ordering to do for tomorrow." "Give us crackers and milk. We'd lots rather have you and crackers and milk than a turkey dinner and not you." "But I can't begin to tell you the things I've got to do today." "Don't want you to begin to tell me," retorted Jamie cheerfully. "I want you to stop telling me. Come, put on your bonnet. I saw Betty in the dining room, and she says she'll put our luncheon up. Now hurry." "Why, Jamie, you ridiculous boy, I can't go," laughed Pollyanna, holding feebly back as he tugged at her dress sleeve. "I can't go to that picnic with you." But she went. She went not only then, but again and again. She could not help going, indeed, for she found arrayed against her not only Jamie, but Jimmy and Mr. Pendleton, to say nothing of Mrs. Carew and Sadie Dean, and even Aunt Polly herself. "And of course I am glad to go," she would sigh happily, when some dreary bit of work was taken out of her hands, in spite of all protesting. But surely never before were there any boarders like mine, teasing for crackers and milk and cold things. And never before was there a boarding mistress like me, running around the country after this fashion. The climax came when one day John Pendleton, and Aunt Polly never ceased to exclaim, because it was John Pendleton, suggested that they all go on a 2 weeks' camping trip to a little lake up among the mountains 40 miles from Beldingsville. The idea was received with enthusiastic approbation by everybody except Aunt Polly. Aunt Polly said privately to Pollyanna that it was all very good and well and desirable that John Pendleton should have gotten out of the sour, morose aloofness that had been his state for so many years, but that it did not necessarily follow that it was equally desirable that he should be trying to turn himself into a 20-year-old boy again. And that was what, in her opinion, he seemed to be doing now. Publicly, she contented herself with saying coldly that she certainly should not go on any insane camping trip to sleep on the damp ground and eat bugs and spiders under the guise of fun. Nor did she think it a sensible thing for anybody over 40 to do. If John Pendleton felt any wound from this shaft, he made no sign. Certainly there was no diminution of apparent interest and enthusiasm on his part, and the plans for the camping expedition came on apace, for it was unanimously decided that even if Aunt Polly would not go, there was no reason why the rest should not. "And Mrs. Carew will be all the chaperone we need, anyhow," Jimmy had declared airily. For a week, therefore, little was talked of but tents, food supplies, cameras, and fishing tackle, and little was done that was not a preparation in some way for the trip. "And let's make it the real thing," proposed Jimmy eagerly. "Yes, even to Mrs. Chilton's bugs and spiders," he added, with a merry smile straight into that lady's severely disapproving eyes. "None of your log cabin, central dining room idea for us. We want real campfires with potatoes baked in the ashes, and we want to sit around and tell stories and roast corn on a stick." "And we want to swim and row and fish," chimed in Pollyanna. "And—" She stopped suddenly, her eyes on Jamie's face. "That is, of course," she corrected quickly, "we wouldn't want to do those things all the time. There'd be quite a lot of quiet things we'd want to do, too. Read and talk, you know." Jamie's eyes darkened. His face grew a little white. His lips parted. But before any words came, Sadie Dean was speaking. "Oh, but on camping trips and picnics, you know, we expect to do outdoor stunts," she interposed feverishly. "And I'm sure we want to. Last summer we were down in Maine, and you should have seen the fish Mr. Carew caught. It was— You tell it," she begged, turning to Jamie. Jamie laughed and shook his head. "They'd never believe it," he objected. "A fish story like that." "Try us," challenged Pollyanna. Jamie still shook his head, but the color had come back to his face, and his eyes were no longer somber as if with pain. Pollyanna, glancing at Sadie Dean, vaguely wondered why she suddenly settled back in her seat with so very evident an air of relief. At last the appointed day came, and the start was made in John Pendleton's big new touring car with Jimmy at the wheel. A whir, a throbbing rumble, a chorus of good-byes, and they were off, with one long shriek of the siren under Jimmy's mischievous fingers. In after days Pollyanna often went back in her thoughts to that first night in camp. The experience was so new and so wonderful in so many ways. It was 4:00 when their 40-mile automobile journey came to an end. Since 3:30 their big car had been ponderously picking its way over an old logging road not designed for six-cylinder automobiles. For the car itself, and for the hand at the wheel, this part of the trip was a most wearing one. But for the merry passengers, who had no responsibility concerning hidden holes and muddy curves, it was nothing but a delight, growing more poignant with every new vista through the green arches, and with every echoing laugh that dodged the low-hanging branches. The site for the camp was one known to John Pendleton years before, and he greeted it now with a satisfied delight that was not unmingled with relief. "Oh, how perfectly lovely!" chorused the others. "Glad you like it. I thought it would be about right," nodded John Pendleton. "Still, I was a little anxious, after all, for these places do change, you know, most remarkably sometimes. And of course this has grown up to bushes a little, but not so but what we can easily clear it." Everybody fell to work then, clearing the ground, putting up the two little tents, unloading the automobile, building the campfire, and arranging the kitchen and pantry. It was then that Pollyanna began especially to notice Jamie and to fear for him. She realized suddenly that the hummocks and hollows and pine-littered knolls were not like a carpeted floor for a pair of crutches, and she saw that Jamie was realizing it too. She saw also that in spite of his infirmity he was trying to take his share in the work, and the sight troubled her. Twice she hurried forward and intercepted him, taking from his arms the box he was trying to carry. "Here, let me take that," she begged. "You've done enough." And the second time she added, "Do go and sit down somewhere to rest, Jamie. You look so tired." If she had been watching closely she would have seen the quick color sweep to his forehead, but she was not watching, so she did not see it. She did see, however, to her intense surprise, Sadie Dean hurried forward a moment later, her arms full of boxes, and heard her cry, "Oh, Mr. Carew, please, if you would give me a lift with these!" The next moment Jamie, once more struggling with the problem of managing a bundle of boxes and 2 crutches, was hastening toward the tents. With a quick word of protest on her tongue, Pollyanna turned to Sadie Dean, but the protest died unspoken, for Sadie, her finger to her lips, was hurrying straight toward her. "I know you didn't think," she stammered in a low voice as she reached Pollyanna's side, "but don't you see? It hurts him to have you think he can't do things like other folks. There, look, see how happy he is now." Pollyanna looked, and she saw. She saw Jamie, his whole self alert, deftly balance his weight on one crutch and swing his burden to the ground. She saw the happy light on his face, and she heard him say nonchalantly, "Here's another contribution from Miss Dean. She asked me to bring this over." "Why, yes, I see," breathed Pollyanna, turning to Sadie Dean. But Sadie Dean had gone. Pollyanna watched Jamie a good deal after that, though she was careful not to let him or anyone else see that she was watching him. And as she watched, her heart ached. Twice she saw him essay a task and fail. Once with a box too heavy for him to lift, once with a folding table too unwieldy for him to carry with his crutches. And each time she saw his quick glance about him to see if others noticed. She saw, too, that unmistakably he was getting very tired, and that his face, in spite of its gay smile, was looking white and drawn, as if he were in pain. "I should think we might have known more," stormed Pollyanna hotly to herself, her eyes blinded with tears. "I should think we might have known more than to let him come to a place like this. Camping, indeed! And with a pair of crutches! Why couldn't we have remembered before we started?" An hour later, around the campfire after supper, Pollyanna had her answer to this question. For with the glowing fire before her and the soft, fragrant dark all about her, she once more fell under the spell of the witchery that fell from Jamie's lips, and she once more forgot Jamie's crutches. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 22, Comrades. They were a merry party, the 6 of them, and a congenial one. There seemed to be no end to the new delights that came with every new day, not the least of which was the new charm of companionship that seemed to be a part of this new life they were living. As Jamie said one night, when they were all sitting about the fire, "You see, we seem to know each other so much better up here in the woods, better in a week than we would in a year in town." "I know it. I wonder why," murmured Mrs. Carew, her eyes dreamily following the leaping blaze. "I think it's something in the air," sighed Pollyanna happily. "There's something about the sky and the woods and the lake so well, there just is, that's all." "I think you mean because the world is shut out," cried Sadie Dean, with a curious little break in her voice. Sadie had not joined in the laugh that followed Pollyanna's limping conclusion. "Up here everything is so real and true that we, too, can be our real, true selves. Not what the world says we are, because we are rich or poor or great or humble, but what we really are ourselves." "Ho!" scoffed Jimmy airily. "All that sounds very fine, but the real common-sense reason is because we don't have any Mrs. Tom and Dick and Harry sitting on their side porches and commenting on every time we stir, and wondering among themselves where we are going, why we are going there, and how long we're intending to stay." "Oh, Jimmy, how you do take the poetry out of things," reproached Pollyanna laughingly. "But that's my business," flashed Jimmy. "How do you suppose I'm going to build dams and bridges if I don't see something besides poetry in the waterfall?" "You can't, Pendleton, and it's the bridge that counts every time," declared Jamie, in a voice that brought a sudden hush to the group about the fire. It was for only a moment, however, for almost at once Sadie Dean broke the silence with a gay, "Pooh! I'd rather have the waterfall every time, without any bridge around to spoil the view." Everybody laughed, and it was as if a tension somewhere snapped. Then Mrs. Carew rose to her feet. "Come, come, children, your stern chaperone says it's bedtime." And with a merry chorus of good nights the party broke up. And so the days passed. To Pollyanna they were wonderful days, and still the most wonderful part was the charm of close companionship, a companionship that, while differing as to details with each one, was yet delightful with all. With Sadie Dean she talked of the new home, and of what a marvelous work Mrs. Carew was doing. They talked, too, of the old days when Sadie was selling bows behind the counter, and of what Mrs. Carew had done for her. Pollyanna heard also something of the old father and mother back home, and of the joy that Sadie, in her new position, had been able to bring into their lives. "And after all, it's really you that began it, you know," she said one day to Pollyanna. But Pollyanna only shook her head at this with an emphatic, "Nonsense! It was all Mrs. Carew." With Mrs. Carew herself, Pollyanna talked also of the home and of her plans for the girls. And once, in the hush of a twilight walk, Mrs. Carew spoke of herself and of her changed outlook on life. And she, like Sadie Dean, said brokenly, "After all, it's really you that began it, Pollyanna." But Pollyanna, as in Sadie Dean's case, would have none of this, and began to talk of Jamie and of what he had done. "Jamie's a dear," Mrs. Carew answered affectionately, "and I love him like an own son. He couldn't be dearer to me if he were really my sister's boy." "Then you don't think he is?" "I don't know. We've never learned anything conclusive. Sometimes I'm sure he is. Then again, I doubt it. I think he really believes he is, bless his heart. At all events, one thing is sure. He has good blood in him from somewhere. Jamie's no ordinary waif of the streets, you know, with his talents. And the wonderful way he has responded to teaching and training proves it." "Of course," nodded Pollyanna. "And as long as you love him so well, it doesn't really matter anyway, does it, whether he's the real Jamie or not?" Mrs. Carew hesitated. Into her eyes crept the old somberness of heartache. "Not so far as he is concerned," she sighed at last. "It's only that sometimes I get to thinking, if he isn't our Jamie, where is Jamie Kent? Is he well? Is he happy? Has he anyone to love him? When I get to thinking like that, Pollyanna, I'm nearly wild. I'd give everything I have in the world, it seems to me, to really know that this boy is Jamie Kent." Pollyanna used to think of this conversation sometimes in her after talks with Jamie. Jamie was so sure of himself. "It's just somehow that I feel it's so," he said once to Pollyanna. "I believe I am Jamie Kent. I've believed it quite a while. I'm afraid I've believed it so long now that I just couldn't bear it to find out I wasn't he. Mrs. Carew has done so much for me. Just think if, after all, I were only a stranger." "But she loves you, Jamie." "I know she does, and that would only hurt all the more, don't you see? Because it would be hurting her. She wants me to be the real Jamie. I know she does. Now if I could only do something for her, make her proud of me in some way. If I could only do something to support myself, even like a man. But what can I do with these?" He spoke bitterly, and laid his hand on the crutches at his side. Pollyanna was shocked and distressed. It was the first time she had heard Jamie speak of his infirmity since the old boyhood days. Frantically she cast about in her mind for just the right thing to say. But before she had even thought of anything, Jamie's face had undergone a complete change. "But there, forget it. I didn't mean to say it," he cried gaily. "And 'twas rank heresy to the game, wasn't it? I'm sure I'm glad I've got the crutches. They're a whole lot nicer than the wheelchair." "And the Jolly Book? Do you keep it now?" asked Pollyanna in a voice that trembled a little. "Sure, I've got a whole library of Jolly Books now," he retorted. "They're all in leather, dark red, except the first one. That is the same little old notebook that Jerry gave me." "Jerry? And I've been meaning all the time to ask for him," cried Pollyanna. "Where is he?" "In Boston. And his vocabulary is just as picturesque as ever. Only he has to tone it down at times. Jerry's still in the newspaper business, but he's getting the news, not selling it. Reporting, you know. I have been able to help him and Mumsy, and don't you suppose I was glad? Mumsy's in a sanatorium for her rheumatism." "And is she better?" "Very much. She's coming out pretty soon and going to housekeeping with Jerry. Jerry's been making up some of his lost schooling during these past few years. He's let me help him, but only as a loan. He's been very particular to stipulate that." "Of course," nodded Pollyanna in approval. "He'd want it that way, I'm sure. I should. It isn't nice to be under obligations that you can't pay. I know how it is. That's why I so wish I could help Aunt Polly out, after all she's done for me." "But you are helping her this summer." Pollyanna lifted her eyebrows. "Yes, I'm keeping summer boarders. I look it, don't I?" she challenged with a flourish of her hands toward her surroundings. "Surely never was a boarding mistress's task quite like mine. And you should have heard Aunt Polly's dire predictions of what summer boarders would be," she chuckled irrepressibly. "What was that?" Pollyanna shook her head decidedly. "Couldn't possibly tell you. That's a dead secret. But—" she stopped and sighed, her face growing wistful again. "This isn't going to last, you know. It can't. Summer boarders don't. I've got to do something winters. I've been thinking. I believe I'll write stories." Jamie turned with a start. "You'll what?" he demanded. "Write stories to sell, you know. You needn't look so surprised. Lots of folks do that. I knew 2 girls in Germany who did." "Did you ever try it?" Jamie still spoke a little queerly. No, not yet," admitted Pollyanna. Then defensively, in answer to the expression on his face, she bridled. "I told you I was keeping summer boarders now. I can't do both at once." "Of course not." She threw him a reproachful glance. "You don't think I can ever do it?" "I didn't say so." "No, but you look it. I don't see why I can't. It isn't like singing. You don't have to have a voice for it. And it isn't like an instrument that you have to learn how to play." "I think it is a little like that." Jamie's voice was low. His eyes were turned away. "How? What do you mean?" "Why, Jamie, just a pencil and paper so that isn't like learning to play the piano or violin." There was a moment's silence. Then came the answer, still in that low, diffident voice, still with the eyes turned away. "The instrument that you play on, Pollyanna, will be the great heart of the world, and to me that seems the most wonderful instrument of all to learn. Under your touch, if you are skillful, It will respond with smiles or tears as you will." Pollyanna drew a tremulous sigh. Her eyes grew wet. "Oh, Jamie, how beautifully you do put things always! I never thought of it that way, but it's so, isn't it? How I would love to do it! Maybe I couldn't do all that, but I've read stories in the magazines, lots of them. Seems as if I could write some like those, anyway. I love to tell stories. I'm always repeating those you tell, and I always laugh and cry, too, just as I do when you tell them." Jamie turned quickly. "Do they make you laugh and cry, Pollyanna? Really?" There was a curious eagerness in his voice. "Of course they do, and you know it, Jamie. And they used to long ago, too, in the Public Garden. Nobody can tell stories like you, Jamie. You ought to be the one writing stories, not I. And say, Jamie, why don't you? You could do it lovely, I know." There was no answer. Jamie apparently did not hear, perhaps because he called at that instant to a chipmunk that was scurrying through the bushes near by. It was not always with Jamie, nor yet with Mrs. Carew and Sadie Dean, that Pollyanna had delightful walks and talks, however. Very often it was with Jimmy or John Pendleton. Pollyanna was sure now that she had never before known John Pendleton. The old taciturn moroseness seemed entirely gone since they came to camp. He rode and swam and fished and tramped with fully as much enthusiasm as did Jimmy himself, and with almost as much vigor. Around the campfire at night he quite rivaled Jamie with his storytelling of adventures, both laughable and thrilling, that had befallen him in his foreign travels. "In the Desert of Sarah, Nancy used to call it," laughed Pollyanna one night as she joined the rest in begging for a story. Better than all this, however, in Pollyanna's opinion, were the times where John Pendleton, with her alone, talked of her mother as he used to know her and love her in the days long gone. That he did so talk with her was a joy to Pollyanna, but a great surprise, too, for never in the past had John Pendleton talked so freely of the girl whom he had so loved hopelessly. Perhaps John Pendleton himself felt some of the surprise, for once he said to Pollyanna musingly, "I wonder why I'm talking to you like this." "Oh, but I love to have you," breathed Pollyanna. "Yes, I know, but I wouldn't think I would do it. It must be, though, that it's because you are so like her as I knew her. You are very like your mother, my dear." "Why, I thought my mother was beautiful!" cried Pollyanna in unconcealed amazement. John Pendleton smiled quizzically. "She was, my dear." Pollyanna looked still more amazed. "Then I don't see how I can be like her." The man laughed outright. "Pollyanna, if some girls had said that, well, never mind what I'd say. You little witch, you poor, homely little Pollyanna." Pollyanna flashed a genuinely distressed reproof straight into the man's merry eyes. "Please, Mr. Pendleton, don't look like that, and don't tease me about that. I'd so love to be beautiful, though of course it sounds silly to say it, and I have a mirror, you know." "Then I advise you to look in it when you are talking sometime," observed the man sententiously. Pollyanna's eyes flew wide open. "Why, that's just what Jimmy said!" she cried. "Did he, indeed, the young rascal?" retorted John Pendleton dryly. Then, with one of the curiously abrupt changes of manner peculiar to him, he said very low, "You have your mother's eyes and smile, Pollyanna, and to me you are beautiful." And Pollyanna, her eyes blinded with sudden hot tears, was silenced. Dear as were these talks, however, they still were not quite like the talks with Jimmy to Pollyanna. For that matter, she and Jimmy did not need to talk to be happy. Jimmy was always so comfortable and comforting. Whether they talked or not did not matter. Jimmy always understood. There was no pulling on her heartstrings for sympathy with Jimmy. Jimmy was delightfully big and strong and happy. Jimmy was not sorrowing for a long-lost nephew, nor pining for the loss of a boyhood sweetheart. Jimmy did not have to swing himself painfully about on a pair of crutches, all of which was so hard to see and know and think of. With Jimmy one could be just glad and happy and free. Jimmy was such a dear. He always rested one so, did Jimmy. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 23, Tied to Two Sticks. It was on the last day at camp that it happened. To Pollyanna it seemed such a pity that it should have happened at all, for it was the first cloud to bring a shadow of regret and unhappiness to her heart during the whole trip, and she found herself futilely sighing. I wish we'd gone home day before yesterday, then it wouldn't have happened. But they had not gone home day before yesterday, and it had happened. And this was the manner of it. Early in the morning of that last day, they all had started on a 2-mile tramp to the basin. "We'll have one more bang-up fish dinner before we go," Jimmy had said, and the rest had joyfully agreed. With luncheon and fishing tackle, therefore, they had made an early start. Laughing and calling gaily to each other, they followed the narrow path through the woods, led by Jimmy, who best knew the way. At first, close behind Jimmy, had walked Pollyanna, but gradually she had fallen back with Jamie, who was last in the line. Pollyanna had thought she detected on Jamie's face the expression which she had come to know was there only when he was attempting something that taxed almost to the breaking point his skill and powers of endurance. She knew that nothing would so offend him as to have her openly notice this state of affairs. At the same time, she also knew that from her, more willingly than from anyone else, would he accept an occasional steadying hand over a troublesome log or stone. Therefore, at the first opportunity to make the change without apparent design, she had dropped back step by step until she had reached her goal, Jamie. She had been rewarded instantly in the way Jamie's face brightened, and in the easy assurance with which he met and conquered a fallen tree trunk across their path, under the pleasant fiction, carefully fostered by Pollyanna, of helping her across. Once out of the woods, their way led along an old stone wall for a time, with wide reaches of sunny, sloping pastures on each side, and a more distant, picturesque farmhouse. It was in the adjoining pasture that Pollyanna saw the goldenrod which she immediately coveted. "Jamie, wait! I'm going to get it," she exclaimed eagerly. "It'll make such a beautiful bouquet for our picnic table." And nimbly she scrambled over the high stone wall and dropped herself down over the other side. It was strange how tantalizing was that goldenrod. Always just ahead she saw another bunch, and yet another, each a little finer than the one within her reach. With joyous exclamations and gay little calls back to the waiting Jamie, Pollyanna, looking particularly attractive in her scarlet sweater, skipped from bunch to bunch, adding to her store. She had both hands full when there came the hideous bellow of an angry bull, the agonized shout from Jamie, and the sound of hoofs thundering down the hillside. What happened next was never clear to her. She knew she dropped her goldenrod and ran as she never ran before, ran as she thought she never could run, back toward the wall and Jamie. She knew that behind her the hoofbeats were gaining, gaining, always gaining. Dimly, hopelessly far ahead of her, she saw Jamie's agonized face and heard his hoarse cries. Then, from somewhere, came a new voice, Jimmy's, shouting a cheery call of courage. Still on and on she ran blindly, hearing nearer and nearer the thud of those pounding hoofs. Once she stumbled and almost fell. Then dizzily she righted herself and plunged forward. She felt her strength quite gone when suddenly, close to her, she heard Jimmy's cheery call again. The next minute she felt herself snatched off her feet and held close to a great throbbing something that dimly she realized was Jimmy's heart. It was all a horrid blur then of cries, hot panting breaths, and pounding hoofs thundering nearer, ever nearer. Then, just as she knew those hoofs to be almost upon her, she felt herself flung, still in Jimmy's arms, sharply to one side, and yet not so far but that she still could feel the hot breath of the maddened animal as he dashed by. Almost at once she found herself on the other side of the wall, with Jimmy bending over her, imploring her to tell him she was not dead. With a hysterical laugh that was yet half a sob, she struggled out of his arms and stood upon her feet. "Dead? No, indeed, thanks to you, Jimmy. I'm all right. I'm all right. Oh, how glad, glad, glad I was to hear your voice. Oh, that was splendid. How did you do it?" she panted. "Pooh, that was nothing. I just—" An inarticulate choking cry brought his words to a sudden halt. He turned to find Jamie face down on the ground a little distance away. Pollyanna was already hurrying toward him. "Jamie! Jamie, what is the matter?" she cried. "Did you fall? Are you hurt?" There was no answer. "What is it, old fellow? Are you hurt?" demanded Jimmy. Still there was no answer. Then suddenly Jamie pulled himself half upright and turned. They saw his face then and fell back, shocked and amazed. "Hurt? Am I hurt?" he choked huskily, flinging out both his hands. "Don't you suppose it hurts to see a thing like that and not be able to do anything? To be tied helpless to a pair of sticks? I tell you there's no hurt in all the world equal to it." But, Jamie," faltered Pollyanna. "Don't!" interrupted the cripple, almost harshly. He had struggled to his feet now. "Don't say anything. I didn't mean to make a scene like this," he finished brokenly, as he turned and swung back along the narrow path that led to the camp. For a minute, as if transfixed, the two behind him watched him go. "Well, by Jove!" breathed Jimmy, then in a voice that shook a little. "That was tough on him. And I didn't think I praised you right before him," half sobbed Pollyanna. "And his hands, did you see them? They were bleeding where the nails had cut right into the flesh," she finished, as she turned and stumbled blindly up the path. "But, Pollyanna, where are you going?" cried Jimmy. "I'm going to Jamie, of course. Do you think I'd leave him like that? Come, we must get him to come back." And Jimmy, with a sigh that was not all for Jamie, went. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 24. Jimmy Wakes Up. Outwardly, the camping trip was pronounced a great success, but inwardly, Pollyanna wondered sometimes if it were all herself, or if there really were a peculiar, indefinable constraint in everybody, with everybody else. Certainly she felt it, and she thought she saw evidences that the others felt it too. As for the cause of it all, unhesitatingly she attributed it to the last day at camp, with its unfortunate trip to the Basin. To be sure, she and Jimmy had easily caught up with Jamie, and had, after considerable coaxing, persuaded him to turn around and go on to the Basin with them. But in spite of everybody's very evident efforts to act as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, nobody really succeeded in doing so. Pollyanna, Jamie, and Jimmy overdid their gaiety a bit, perhaps, and the others, while not knowing exactly what had happened, very evidently felt that something was not quite right, though they plainly tried to hide the fact that they did feel so. Naturally, in this state of affairs, restful happiness was out of the question. Even the anticipated fish dinner was flavorless, and early in the afternoon the start was made back to the camp. Once home again, Pollyanna had hoped that the unhappy episode of the angry bull would be forgotten, but she could not forget it. So in all fairness she could not blame the others if they could not. Always she thought of it now when she looked at Jamie. She saw again the agony on his face, the crimson stain on the palms of his hands. Her heart ached for him, and because it did so ache, his mere presence had come to be a pain to her. Remorsefully she confessed to herself that she did not like to be with Jamie now, nor to talk with him. But that did not mean that she was not often with him. She was with him, indeed, much oftener than before, for so remorseful was she, and so fearful was she that he would detect her unhappy frame of mind, that she lost no opportunity of responding to his overtures of comradeship. And sometimes she deliberately sought him out. This last she did not often have to do, however, for more and more frequently these days Jamie seemed to be turning to her for companionship. The reason for this, Pollyanna believed, was to be found in this same incident of the bull and the rescue. Not that Jamie ever referred to it directly. He never did that. He was, too, even gayer than usual. But Pollyanna thought she detected sometimes a bitterness underneath it all that was never there before. Certainly she could not help seeing that at times he seemed almost to want to avoid the others, and that he actually sighed, as if with relief, when he found himself alone with her. She thought she knew why this was so, after he said to her, as he did one day while they were watching the others play tennis, "You see, after all, Pollyanna, there isn't anyone who can quite understand as you can." Understand? Pollyanna had not known what he meant at first. They had been watching the players for 5 minutes without a word between them. Yes, for you, once, couldn't walk yourself. Oh, yes, I know, faltered Pollyanna, and she knew that her great distress must have shown in her face, for so quickly and so blithely did he change the subject after laughing. Come on, Pollyanna, why don't you tell me to play the game? I would if I were in your place. Forget it, please. I was a brute to make you look like that. And Pollyanna smiled and said, No, 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 indeed. But she did not forget it. She could not. And it all made her only the more anxious to be with Jamie and help him all she could. As if now I'd ever let him see that I was ever anything but glad when he was with me, she thought fervently, as she hurried forward a minute later to take her turn in the game. Pollyanna, however, was not the only one in the party who felt a new awkwardness and constraint. Jimmy Pendleton felt it, though he, too, tried not to show it. Jimmy was not happy these days. From a carefree youth, whose visions were of wonderful spans across hitherto unbridgeable chasms, He has come to be an anxious-eyed young man whose visions were of a feared rival bearing away the girl he loved. Jimmy knew very well now that he was in love with Pollyanna. He suspected that he had been in love with her for some time. He stood aghast, indeed, to find himself so shaken and powerless before this thing that had come to him. He knew that even his beloved bridges were as nothing when weighed against the smile in a girl's eyes and the word on a girl's lips. He realized that the most wonderful span in the world to him would not be the thing that could help him to cross the chasm of fear and doubt that he felt lay between him and Pollyanna. Doubt because of Pollyanna, fear because of Jamie. Not until he had seen Pollyanna in jeopardy that day in the pasture had he realized how empty would be the world, his world, without her. Not until his wild dash for safety with Pollyanna in his arms had he realized how precious she was to him. For a moment, indeed, with his arms about her, and hers clinging about his neck, he had felt that she was indeed his. And even in that supreme moment of danger, he knew the thrill of supreme bliss. Then, a little later, he had seen Jamie's face and Jamie's hands. To him they could mean but one thing. Jamie, too, loved Pollyanna, and Jamie had to stand by helpless, tied to 2 sticks. That was what he had said. Jimmy believed that. Had he himself been obliged to stand by helpless, tied to 2 sticks, while another rescued the girl that he loved, he would have looked like that. Jimmy had gone back to camp that day with his thoughts in a turmoil of fear and rebellion. He wondered if Pollyanna cared for Jamie. That was where the fear came in. But even if she did care a little, must he stand aside weakly and let Jamie, without a struggle, make her learn to care more? That was where the rebellion came in. Indeed, no, he would not do it, decided Jimmy. It should be a fair fight between them. Then, all by himself as he was, Jimmy flushed hot to the roots of his hair. Would it be a fair fight? Could any fight between him and Jamie be a fair fight? Jimmy felt suddenly as he had felt years before when, as a lad, he had challenged a new boy to a fight for an apple they both claimed. Then, at the first blow, had discovered that the new boy had a crippled arm. He had purposely lost then, of course, and had let the crippled boy win. But he told himself fiercely now that this case was different. It was no apple that was at stake. It was his life's happiness. It might even be Pollyanna's life's happiness, too. Perhaps she did not care for Jamie at all, but would care for her old friend Jimmy, if he but once showed her he wanted her to care. And he would show her. He would. Once again Jimmy blushed hotly, but he frowned, too, angrily. If only he could forget how Jamie had looked when he had uttered that moaning, "Tied to 2 sticks!" If only. But what was the use? It was not a fair fight, and he knew it. He knew, too, right there and then, that his decision would be just what it afterwards proved to be. He would watch and wait. He would give Jamie his chance, and if Pollyanna showed that she cared, he would take himself off and away quite out of their lives, and they should never know, either of them, how bitterly he was suffering. He would go back to his bridges, as if any bridge, though it led to the moon itself, could compare for a moment with Pollyanna. But he would do it. He must do it. It was all very fine and heroic, and Jimmy felt so exalted he was a-tingle with something that was almost happiness when he finally dropped off to sleep that night. But martyrdom, in theory and practice, differs woefully, and as would-be martyrs have found out from time immemorial. It was all very well to decide alone and in the dark that he would give Jamie his chance, but it was quite another matter really to do it when it involved nothing less than the leaving of Pollyanna and Jamie together almost every time he saw them. Then, too, he was very much worried at Pollyanna's apparent attitude toward the lame youth. It looked very much to Jimmy as if she did indeed care for him. So watchful was she of his comfort, so apparently eager to be with him. Then, as if to settle any possible doubt in Jimmy's mind, there came the day when Sadie Dean had something to say on the subject. They were all out in the tennis court. Sadie was sitting alone when Jimmy strolled up to her. "You next with Pollyanna, isn't it?" he queried. She shook her head. "Pollyanna isn't playing any more this morning." "Isn't playing?" frowned Jimmy, who had been counting on his own game with Pollyanna. "Why not?" For a brief minute Sadie Dean did not answer. Then, with very evident difficulty, she said, "Pollyanna told me last night that she thought we were playing tennis too much, that it wasn't kind to Mr. Carew as long as he can't play." "I know, but—" Jimmy stopped helplessly, the frown plowing a deeper furrow into his forehead. The next instant he fairly started with surprise at the tense something in Sadie Dean's voice as she said, "But he doesn't want her to stop. He doesn't want any one of us to make any difference for him. It's that hurts him so much. She doesn't understand. She doesn't understand. But I do. She thinks she does, though." Something in words or manner sent a sudden pang to Jimmy's heart. He threw a sharp look into her face. A question flew to his lips. For a moment he held it back. Then, trying to hide his earnestness with a bantering smile, he let it come. "Why, Miss Dean, you don't mean to convey the idea that there's any special interest in each other between those two, do you?" She gave him a scornful glance. "Where have your eyes been? She worships him. I mean, they worship each other," she corrected hastily. Jimmy, with an inarticulate ejaculation, turned and walked away abruptly. He could not trust himself to remain longer. He did not wish to talk any more just then to Sadie Dean. So abruptly, indeed, did he turn that he did not notice that Sadie Dean, too, turned hurriedly and busied herself looking in the grass at her feet, as if she had lost something. Very evidently Sadie Dean also did not wish to talk any more just then. Jimmy Pendleton told himself that it was not true at all, that it was all falderall, what Sadie Dean had said. Yet, nevertheless, true or not true, he could not forget it. It colored all his thoughts thereafter, and loomed before his eyes like a shadow whenever he saw Pollyanna and Jamie together. He watched their faces covertly. He listened to the tones of their voices. He came then in time to think it was, after all, true, that they did worship each other, and his heart, in consequence, grew like lead within him. True to his promise to himself, however, he turned resolutely away. The die was cast, he told himself. Pollyanna was not for him. Restless days for Jimmy followed. To stay away from the Harrington homestead entirely he did not dare, lest his secret be suspected. To be with Pollyanna at all now was torture. Even to be with Sadie Dean was unpleasant, for he could not forget that it was Sadie Dean who had finally opened his eyes. Jamie certainly was no haven of refuge under the circumstances, and that left only Mrs. Carew. Mrs. Carew, however, was a host in herself, and Jimmy found his only comfort these days in her society. Gay or grave, she always seemed to know how to fit his mood exactly, and it was wonderful how much she knew about bridges, the kind of bridges he was going to build. She was so wise, too, and so sympathetic, knowing always just the right word to say. He even one day almost told her about the packet. But John Pendleton interrupted them at just the wrong moment, so the story was not told. John Pendleton was always interrupting them at just the wrong moment, Jimmy thought vexedly sometimes. Then, when he remembered what John Pendleton had done for him, he was ashamed. The packet was a thing that dated back to Jimmy's boyhood, and had never been mentioned to anyone save to John Pendleton, and that only once at the time of his adoption. The packet was nothing but rather a large white envelope, worn with time and plump with mystery behind a huge red seal. It had been given him by his father, and it bore the following instructions in his father's hand: "To my boy Jimmy, not to be opened until his 30th birthday, except in case of his death, when it shall be opened at once." There were times when Jimmy speculated a good deal as to the contents of that envelope. There were other times when he forgot its existence. In the old days at the orphan's home, his chief terror had been that it should be discovered and taken away from him. In those days he wore it always hidden in the lining of his coat. Of late years, at John Pendleton's suggestion, it had been tucked away in the Pendleton safe. "For there's no knowing how valuable it may be," John Pendleton had said, with a smile. "And anyway, your father evidently wanted you to have it, and we wouldn't want to run the risk of losing it." "No, I wouldn't want to lose it, of course," Jimmy had smiled back a little soberly. "But I'm not counting on its being real valuable, sir. Poor Dad didn't have anything that was very valuable about him, as I remember." It was this packet that Jimmy came so near mentioning to Mrs. Carew one day, if only John Pendleton had not interrupted them. "Still, maybe it's just as well I didn't tell her about it," Jimmy reflected afterwards on his way home. "She might have thought Dad had something in his life that wasn't quite right, and I wouldn't have wanted her to think that of Dad." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 25, The Game and Pollyanna. Before the middle of September, the Carews and Sadie Dean said goodbye and went back to Boston. Much as she knew she would miss them, Pollyanna drew an actual sigh of relief as the train, bearing them away, rolled out of the Beldingsville station. Pollyanna would not have admitted having this feeling of relief to anyone else, and even to herself she apologized in her thoughts. "It isn't that I don't love them dearly, every one of them," she sighed, watching the train disappear around the curve far down the track. "It's only that I'm so sorry for poor Jamie all the time, and I am tired. I shall be glad for a while just to go back to the old quiet days with Jimmy." Pollyanna, however, did not go back to the old quiet days with Jimmy. The days that immediately followed the going of the Carews were quiet, certainly, but they were not passed with Jimmy. Jimmy rarely came near the house now, and when he did call, he was not the old Jimmy that she used to know. He was moody, restless, and silent, or else very gay and talkative in a nervous fashion that was most puzzling and annoying. Before long, too, he himself went to Boston, and then, of course, she did not see him at all. Pollyanna was surprised then to see how much she missed him, even to know that he was in town and that there was a chance that he might come over was better than the dreary emptiness of certain absence. And even his puzzling moods of alternating gloominess and gaiety were preferable to this utter silence of nothingness. Then one day, suddenly, she pulled herself up with hot cheeks and shamed eyes. "Why, Pollyanna Whittier," she upbraided herself sharply, "one would think you were in love with Jimmy Bean Pendleton. Can't you think of anything but him?" Whereupon, forthwith, she bestirred herself to be very gay and lively indeed, and to put this Jimmy Bean Pendleton out of her thoughts. As it happened, Aunt Polly, though unwittingly, helped her to this. With the going of the Carews had gone also their chief source of immediate income, and Aunt Polly was beginning to worry again, audibly, about the state of their finances. "I don't know really, Pollyanna, what is going to become of us," she would moan frequently. "Of course, we are a little ahead now from this summer's work, and we have a small sum from the estate right along, but I never know how soon that's going to stop, like all the rest. If only we could do something to bring in some ready cash." It was after one of these moaning lamentations one day that Pollyanna's eyes chanced to fall on a prize story contest offer. It was a most alluring one. The prizes were large and numerous. The conditions were set forth in glowing terms. To read it, one would think that to win out were the easiest thing in the world. It contained even a special appeal that might have been framed for Pollyanna herself. "This is for you, you who read this," it ran. "What if you never have written a story before? That is no sign you cannot write one. Try it, that's all. Wouldn't you like $3,000, 2,000, 1,000, 500, or even 100? Then why not go after it?" "The very thing!" cried Pollyanna, clapping her hands. "I'm so glad I saw it. And it says I can do it, too. I thought I could. If I'd just try. I'll go tell Auntie so she needn't worry any more." Pollyanna was on her feet and halfway to the door when a second thought brought her steps to a pause. "Come to think of it, I reckon I won't, after all. It'll be all the nicer to surprise her. And if I should get the first one—" Pollyanna went to sleep that night planning what she could do with that $3,000. Pollyanna began her story the next day. That is, she, with a very important air, got out a quantity of paper, sharpened up half a dozen pencils, and established herself at the big, old-fashioned Harrington desk in the living room. After biting restlessly at the ends of two of her pencils, she wrote down 3 words on the fair white page before her. Then she drew a long sigh, threw aside the second ruined pencil, and picked up a slender green one with a beautiful point. This point she eyed with a meditative frown. "Oh, dear! I wonder where they get their titles," she despaired. "Maybe, though, I ought to decide on the story first, and then make a title to fit. Anyhow, I'm going to do it." And forthwith she drew a black line through the 3 words and poised the pencil for a fresh start. The start was not made at once, however. Even when it was made, it must have been a false one, for at the end of half an hour the whole page was nothing but a jumble of scratched-out lines, with only a few words here and there left to tell the tale. At this juncture Aunt Polly came into the room. She turned tired eyes upon her niece. "Well, Pollyanna, what are you up to now?" she demanded. Pollyanna laughed and colored guiltily. "Nothing much, Auntie. Anyhow, it doesn't look as if it were much yet," she admitted with a rueful smile. "Besides, it's a secret, and I'm not going to tell it yet." "Very well. Suit yourself," sighed Aunt Polly. "But I can tell you right now that if you're trying to make anything different out of those mortgage papers Mr. Hart left, it's useless. I've been all over them myself twice." "No, dear, it isn't the papers. It's a whole heap nicer than any papers ever could be," crowed Pollyanna triumphantly, turning back to her work. In Pollyanna's eyes suddenly had risen a glowing vision of what it might be, with that $3,000 once hers. For still another half hour Pollyanna wrote and scratched, and chewed her pencils. Then, with her courage dulled but not destroyed, she gathered up her papers and pencils and left the room. "I reckon maybe I'll do better by myself upstairs," she was thinking as she hurried through the hall. "I thought I ought to do it at a desk, being literary work, so. But anyhow, the desk didn't help me any this morning. I'll try the window seat in my room." The window seat, however, proved to be no more inspiring, judging by the scratched and re-scratched pages that fell from Pollyanna's hands. And at the end of another half-hour Pollyanna discovered suddenly that it was time to get dinner. "Well, I'm glad 'tis, anyhow," she sighed to herself. "I'd a lot rather get dinner than do this. Not but that I want to do this, of course. Only I'd no idea 'twas such an awful job. Just a story, so." During the following month Pollyanna worked faithfully, doggedly, but she soon found that just a story so was indeed no small matter to accomplish. Pollyanna, however, was not one to set her hand to the plow and look back. Besides, there was that $3,000 prize, or even any of the others if she should not happen to win the first one. Of course, even $100 was something. So day after day she wrote and erased and rewrote, until finally the story, such as it was, lay completed before her. Then, with some misgivings, it must be confessed, she took the manuscript to Milly Snow to be typewritten. "It reads all right. That is, it makes sense," mused Pollyanna doubtfully, as she hurried along toward the Snow cottage. "And it's a real nice story about a perfectly lovely girl. But there's something somewhere that isn't quite right about it, I'm afraid. Anyhow, I don't believe I'd better count too much on the first prize. Then I won't be too much disappointed when I get one of the littler ones." Pollyanna always thought of Jimmy when she went to the Snows, for it was at the side of the road near their cottage that she had first seen him as a forlorn little runaway lad from the orphans' home years before. She thought of him again today with a little catch of her breath. Then, with the proud lifting of her head that always came now with the second thought of Jimmy, she hurried up the Snows' doorsteps and rang the bell. As was usually the case, the Snows had nothing but the warmest of welcomes for Pollyanna, and also, as usual, it was not long before they were talking of the game. In no home in Beldingsville was the glad game more ardently played than in the Snows. "Well, and how are you getting along?" asked Pollyanna when she had finished the business part of her call. "Splendidly," beamed Milly Snow. "This is the third job I've got this week. Oh, Miss Pollyanna, I'm so glad you had me take up typewriting, for you see I can do that right at home, and it's all owing to you." "Nonsense!" disclaimed Pollyanna merrily. "But it is. In the first place, I couldn't have done it anyhow if it hadn't been for the game, making Mother so much better, you know, that I had some time to myself. And then, at the very first, you suggested typewriting, and helped me to buy a machine. I should like to know if that doesn't come pretty near owing it all to you." But once again Pollyanna objected. This time she was interrupted by Mrs. Snow from her wheelchair by the window, and so earnestly and gravely did Mrs. Snow speak that Pollyanna, in spite of herself, could but hear what she had to say. "Listen, child, I don't think you know quite what you've done, but I wish you could. There's a little look in your eyes, my dear, today that I don't like to see there. You are plagued and worried over something, I know. I can see it. And I don't wonder. Your uncle's death, your aunt's condition, everything. I won't say more about that. But there's something I do want to say, my dear, and you must let me say it, for I can't bear to see that shadow in your eyes without trying to drive it away by telling you what you've done for me, for this whole town, and for countless other people everywhere." "Mrs. Snow!" protested Pollyanna, in genuine distress. "Oh, I mean it, and I know what I'm talking about," nodded the invalid triumphantly. "To begin with, look at me. Didn't you find me a fretful, whining creature who never by any chance wanted what she had until she found what she didn't have? And didn't you open my eyes by bringing me 3 kinds of things so I'd have to have what I wanted for once? Oh, Mrs. Snow, was I really ever quite so impertinent as that? murmured Pollyanna with a painful blush. "It wasn't impertinent," objected Mrs. Snow stoutly. "You didn't mean it as impertinence, and that made all the difference in the world. You didn't preach either, my dear. If you had, you'd never have got me to playing the game, nor anybody else, I fancy. But you did get me to playing it, and see what it's done for me and for Milly. Here I am so much better that I can sit in a wheelchair and go anywhere on this floor in it. That means a whole lot when it comes to waiting on yourself and giving those around you a chance to breathe, meaning Milly in this case. And the doctor says it's all owing to the game. Then there's others, quantities of others, right in this town that I'm hearing of all the time. Nellie Mahoney broke her wrist and was so glad it wasn't her leg that she didn't mind the wrist at all. Old Mrs. Tibbets has lost her hearing, but she's so glad 'tisn't her eyesight that she's actually happy. Do you remember Cross-eyed Joe that they used to call Cross Joe because of his temper? Nothing went to suit him either, any more than it did me. Well, somebody's taught him the game, they say, and made a different man of him. And listen, dear, it's not only this town, but other places. I had a letter yesterday from my cousin in Massachusetts, and she told me all about Mrs. Tom Payson that used to live here. Do you remember them? They lived on the way up Pendleton Hill. Yes, oh yes, I remember them, cried Pollyanna. Well, they left here that winter you were in the sanatorium and went to Massachusetts where my sister lives. She knows them well. She says Mrs. Payson told her all about you and how your glad game actually saved them from a divorce. And now not only do they play it themselves, but they've got quite a lot of others playing it down there, and they're getting still others. So you see, dear, there's no telling where that glad game of yours is going to stop. I wanted you to know. I thought it might help, even you, to play the game sometimes. For don't think I don't understand, dearie, that it is hard for you to play your own game sometimes. Pollyanna rose to her feet. She smiled, but her eyes glistened with tears as she held out her hand in good-bye. "Thank you, Mrs. Snow," she said unsteadily. "It is hard sometimes, and maybe I did need a little help about my own game. But anyhow, now," her eyes flashed with their old merriment, "if any time I think I can't play the game myself, I can remember that I can still always be glad that there are some folks playing it." Pollyanna walked home a little soberly that afternoon. Touched as she was by what Mrs. Snow had said, there was yet an undercurrent of sadness in it all. She was thinking of Aunt Polly who played the game now so seldom, and she was wondering if she herself always played it when she might. "Maybe I haven't been careful always to hunt up the glad side of the things Aunt Polly says," she thought with undefined guiltiness. "And maybe if I played the game better myself, Aunt Polly would play it a little. Anyhow, I'm going to try. If I don't look out, all these other people will be playing my own game better than I am myself." End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 26. John Pendleton. It was just a week before Christmas that Pollyanna sent her story, now neatly typewritten, in for the contest. The prize winners would not be announced until April, the magazine notice said, so Pollyanna settled herself for the long wait with characteristic philosophical patience. "I don't know, anyhow, but I'm glad 'tis so long," she told herself. "For all winter I can have the fun of thinking it may be the first one, instead of one of the others, that I'll get. I might just as well think I'm going to get it than if I do get it, I won't have been unhappy any. While if I don't get it, I won't have had all these weeks of unhappiness beforehand, anyway, and I can be glad for one of the smaller ones then." That she might not get any prize was not in Pollyanna's calculations at all. The story, so beautifully typed by Milly Snow, looked almost as good as printed already to Pollyanna. Christmas was not a happy time at the Harrington homestead that year, in spite of Pollyanna's strenuous efforts to make it so. Aunt Polly refused absolutely to allow any sort of celebration of the day, and made her attitude so unmistakably plain that Pollyanna could not give even the simplest of presents. Christmas evening John Pendleton called. Mrs. Chilton excused herself, but Pollyanna, utterly worn out from a long day with her aunt, welcomed him joyously. But even here she found a fly in the amber of her content, for John Pendleton had brought with him a letter from Jimmy, and the letter was full of nothing but the plans he and Mrs. Carew were making for a wonderful Christmas celebration at the Home for Working Girls. And Pollyanna, ashamed though she was to own it to herself, was not in a mood to hear about Christmas celebrations just then, least of all Jimmy's. John Pendleton, however, was not ready to let the subject drop, even when the letter had been read. "Great doings, those!" he exclaimed as he folded the letter. "Yes, indeed, fine!" murmured Pollyanna, trying to speak with due enthusiasm. "And it's tonight, too, isn't it? I'd like to drop in on them about now." "Yes," murmured Pollyanna again, with still more careful enthusiasm. "Mrs. Carew knew what she was about when she got Jimmy to help her, I fancy," chuckled the man. "But I'm wondering how Jimmy likes it, playing Santa Claus to 100 young women at once." "Why, he finds it delightful, of course." Pollyanna lifted her chin ever so slightly. "Maybe. Still, it's a little different from learning to build bridges, you must confess." "Oh, yes. But I'll risk Jimmy, and I'll risk wagering that those girls never had a better time than he'll give them tonight, too." Yes, of course," stammered Pollyanna, trying to keep the hated tremulousness out of her voice, and trying very hard not to compare her own dreary evening in Beldingsville, with nobody but John Pendleton, to those of those 50 girls in Boston with Jimmy. There was a brief pause, during which John Pendleton gazed dreamily at the dancing fire on the hearth. "She's a wonderful woman, Mrs. Carew is," he said at last. "She is, indeed." This time the enthusiasm in Pollyanna's voice was all pure gold. "Jimmy's written me before something of what she's done for those girls," went on the man, still gazing into the fire. "In just the last letter before this he wrote a lot about it, and about her. He said he always admired her, but never so much as now, when he can see what she really is." "She's a dear, that's what Mrs. Carew is," declared Pollyanna warmly. "She's a dear in every way, and I love her." John Pendleton stirred suddenly. He turned to Pollyanna with an oddly whimsical look in his eyes. "I know you do, my dear. For that matter, there may be others, too, that love her." Pollyanna's heart skipped a beat. A sudden thought came to her with stunning, blinding force. Jimmy! Could John Pendleton be meaning that Jimmy cared that way for Mrs. Carew? "You mean?" she faltered. She could not finish. With a nervous twitch peculiar to him, John Pendleton got to his feet. "I mean the girls, of course," he answered lightly, still with that whimsical smile. "Don't you suppose those 50 girls love her most to death?" Pollyanna said, "Yes, of course," and murmured something else, appropriate, in answer to John Pendleton's next remark. But her thoughts were in a tumult, and she let the man do most of the talking for the rest of the evening. Nor did John Pendleton seem averse to this. Restlessly he took a turn or two about the room, then sat down in his old place. And when he spoke, it was on the old subject, Mrs. Carew. Queer about that Jamie of hers, isn't it? I wonder if he is her nephew." As Pollyanna did not answer, the man went on after a moment's silence. "He's a fine fellow, anyway. I like him. There's something fine and genuine about him. She's bound up in him, that's plain to be seen, whether he's really her kin or not." There was another pause. Then, in a slightly altered voice, John Pendleton said, "Still, it's queer, too, when you come to think of it, that she never married again. She is certainly now a very beautiful woman. Don't you think so?" "Yes, yes, indeed she is," plunged in Pollyanna, with a precipitate haste. A very beautiful woman." There was a little break at the last in Pollyanna's voice. Pollyanna just then had caught sight of her own face in the mirror opposite, and Pollyanna to herself was never a very beautiful woman. On and on rambled John Pendleton, musingly, contentedly, his eyes on the fire. Whether he was answered or not seemed not to disturb him. Whether he was even listened to or not, he seemed hardly to know. He wanted, apparently, only to talk. But at last he got to his feet reluctantly and said good night. For a weary half hour Pollyanna had been longing for him to go, that she might be alone. But after he had gone she wished he were back. She had found suddenly that she did not want to be alone with her thoughts. It was wonderfully clear to Pollyanna now. There was no doubt of it. Jimmy cared for Mrs. Carew. That was why he was so moody and restless after she left. That was why he had come so seldom to see her, Pollyanna, his old friend. That was why. Countless little circumstances of the past summer flocked to Pollyanna's memory now, mute witnesses that would not be denied. And why should he not care for her? Mrs. Carew was certainly beautiful and charming. True, she was older than Jimmy, but young men had married women far older than she many times. And if they loved each other— Pollyanna cried herself to sleep that night. In the morning, bravely she tried to face the thing. She even tried, with a tearful smile, to put it to the test of the glad game. She was reminded then of something that Nancy had said to her years before. "If there is a set of folks in the world that wouldn't have no use for this 'ere game o' yourn, it'd be a pair of quarrelin' lovers." Not that we're quarreling, or even lovers, thought Pollyanna blushingly, but just the same, I can be glad he's glad, and glad she's glad, too. Only— Even to herself Pollyanna could not finish this sentence. Being so sure now that Jimmy and Mrs. Carew cared for each other, Pollyanna became peculiarly sensitive to everything that tended to strengthen that belief. And being ever on the watch for it, she found it, as was to be expected, first in Mrs. Carew's letters. "I am seeing a lot of your friend, young Pendleton," Mrs. Carew wrote one day, "and I'm liking him more and more. I do wish, however, just for curiosity's sake, that I could trace to its source that elusive feeling that I've seen him before somewhere." Frequently after this she mentioned him casually, and to Pollyanna, in the very casualness of these references, lay their sharpest sting, for it showed so unmistakably that Jimmy and Jimmy's presence were now to Mrs. Carew a matter of course. From other sources, too, Pollyanna found fuel for the fire of her suspicions. More and more frequently John Pendleton dropped in with his stories of Jimmy and of what Jimmy was doing. And always here there was mention of Mrs. Carew. Poor Pollyanna wondered indeed sometimes if John Pendleton could not talk of anything but Mrs. Carew and Jimmy, so constantly was one or the other of those names on his lips. There were Sadie Dean's letters, too, and they told of Jimmy and of what he was doing to help Mrs. Carew. Even Jamie, who wrote occasionally, had his mite to add, for he wrote one evening, It's 10 o'clock. I'm sitting here alone waiting for Mrs. Carew to come home. She and Pendleton have been to one of their usual socials down to the home." From Jimmy himself Pollyanna heard very rarely, and for that, she told herself mournfully, that she could be glad. "For if he can't write about anything but Mrs. Carew and those girls, I'm glad he doesn't write very often," she sighed. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 27. The Day Pollyanna Did Not Play. And so, one by one, the winter days passed. January and February slipped away in snow and sleet, and March came in with a gale that whistled and moaned around the old house, and set loose blinds to swinging and loose gates to creaking in a way that was most trying to nerves already stretched to the breaking point. Pollyanna was not finding it very easy these days to play the game, but she was playing it faithfully, valiantly. Aunt Polly was not playing it at all, which certainly did not make it any the easier for Pollyanna to play it. Aunt Polly was blue and discouraged. She was not well, too, and she had plainly abandoned herself to utter gloom. Pollyanna still was counting on the prize contest. She had dropped from the first prize to one of the smaller ones, however. Pollyanna had been writing more stories, and the regularity with which they came back from their pilgrimages to magazine editors was beginning to shake her faith in her success as an author. "Oh, well, I can be glad that Aunt Polly doesn't know anything about it anyway," declared Pollyanna to herself bravely, as she twisted in her fingers the declined with thanks slip that had just towed in one more shipwrecked story. "She can't worry about this. She doesn't know about it." All of Pollyanna's life these days revolved around Aunt Polly, and it is doubtful if even Aunt Polly herself realized how exacting she had become and how entirely her niece was giving up her life to her. It was on a particularly gloomy day in March that matters came, in a way, to a climax. Pollyanna, upon arising, had looked at the sky with a sigh. Aunt Polly was always more difficult on cloudy days. With a gay little song, however, that still sounded a bit forced, Pollyanna descended to the kitchen and began to prepare breakfast. "I reckon I'll make corn muffins," she told the stove confidentially. "Then maybe Aunt Polly won't mind other things so much." Half an hour later she tapped at her aunt's door. "Up so soon? Oh, that's fine! And you've done your hair yourself!" "I couldn't sleep. I had to get up," sighed Aunt Polly wearily. "I had to do my hair, too. You weren't here." "But I didn't suppose you were ready for me, Auntie," explained Pollyanna hurriedly. "Never mind, though. You'll be glad I wasn't when you find what I've been doing." "Well, I shan't. Not this morning," frowned Aunt Polly perversely. "Nobody could be glad this morning. Look at it rain! That makes the third rainy day this week." "That's so. But you know the sun never seems quite so perfectly lovely as it does after a lot of rain like this," smiled Pollyanna, deftly arranging a bit of lace and ribbon at her aunt's throat. "Now come, breakfast's all ready. Just you wait till you see what I've got for you." Aunt Polly, however, was not to be diverted even by corn muffins this morning. Nothing was right. Nothing was even endurable, as she felt, and Pollyanna's patience was sorely taxed before the meal was over. To make matters worse, the roof over the east attic window had found to be leaking, and an unpleasant letter came in the mail. Pollyanna, true to her creed, laughingly declared that, for her part, she was glad they had a roof to leak, and that, as for the letter, she'd been expecting it for a week anyway, and she was actually glad she wouldn't have to worry any more for fear it would come. It couldn't come now because it had, and 'twas over with. All this, together with sundry other hindrances and annoyances, delayed the usual morning work until far into the afternoon, something that was always particularly displeasing to methodical Aunt Polly, who ordered her own life preferably by the tick of the clock. "But it is 3:30, Pollyanna, already. Did you know it?" she fretted at last. "And you haven't made the beds yet." "No, dearie, but I will. Don't worry." "But did you hear what I said? Look at the clock, child. It's after 3 o'clock." "So 'tis, but never mind, Aunt Polly. We can be glad 'tisn't after 4." Aunt Polly sniffed her disdain. "I suppose you can," she observed tartly. Pollyanna laughed. "Well, you see, Auntie, clocks are accommodating things when you stop to think about it. I found that out long ago at the sanatorium. When I was doing something that I liked and I didn't want the time to go fast, I'd just look at the hour hand and I'd feel as if I had lots of time, it went so slow. Then other days, when I had to keep something that hurt on for an hour maybe, I'd watch the little second hand, and you see that I felt as if old Time was just humping himself to help me out by going as fast as ever he could. Now I'm watching the hour hand today, 'cause I don't want time to go fast. See?" she twinkled mischievously as she hurried from the room, before Aunt Polly had time to answer. It was certainly a hard day, and by night Pollyanna looked pale and worn out. This, too, was a source of worriment to Aunt Polly. "Dear me, child, you look tired to death," she fumed. "What we're going to do I don't know. I suppose you'll be sick next." "Nonsense, Auntie, I'm not sick a bit," declared Pollyanna, dropping herself with a sigh onto the couch. "Whew, but I am tired. My, how good this couch feels! I'm glad I'm tired, after all. It's so nice to rest." Aunt Polly turned with an impatient gesture. "Glad, glad, glad! Of course you're glad, Pollyanna. You're always glad for everything. I never saw such a girl. Oh, yes, I know it's the game," she went on, in an answer to the look that came to Pollyanna's face. "And it's a very good game, too. But I think you carry it altogether too far. This eternal doctrine of it might be worse has got on my nerves, Pollyanna. Honestly, it would be a real relief if you wouldn't be glad for something sometime." "Why, Auntie!" Pollyanna pulled herself half erect. "Well, it would. You just try it sometime and see." "But, Auntie, Pollyanna stopped and eyed her aunt reflectively. An odd look came to her eyes. A slow smile curved her lips. Mrs. Chilton, who had turned back to her work, paid no heed, and after a minute Pollyanna lay back on the couch without finishing her sentence, the curious smile still on her lips. It was raining again when Pollyanna got up the next morning, and a northeast wind was still whistling down the chimney. Pollyanna, at the window, drew an involuntary sigh, but almost at once her face changed. "Oh, well, I'm glad." She clapped her hands to her lips. "Dear me," she chuckled softly, her eyes dancing. "I shall forget. I know I shall. And that'll spoil it all. I must just remember not to be glad for anything, not anything today." Pollyanna did not make corn muffins this morning. She started the breakfast and went to her aunt's room. Mrs. Chilton was still in bed. "I see it rains as usual," she observed by way of greeting. "Yes, it's horrid, perfectly horrid," scolded Pollyanna. "It's rained most every day this week, too. I hate such weather." Aunt Polly turned with a faint surprise in her eyes, but Pollyanna was looking the other way. "Are you going to get up now?" she asked, a little wearily. "Why, yes," murmured Aunt Polly, still with that faint surprise in her eyes. "What's the matter, Pollyanna? Are you especially tired?" "Yes, I am tired this morning. I didn't sleep well, either. I hate not to sleep. Things always plague you so in the night when you wake up." "I guess I know that," fretted Aunt Polly. "I didn't sleep a wink after 2 o'clock myself. And there's that roof. How are we going to have it fixed, pray, if it never stops raining? Have you been up to empty the pans?" "Oh, yes. Anne took up some more. There's a new leak now, further over." "A new one? Why, it'll all be leaking yet." Pollyanna opened her lips. She had almost said, "Well, we can be glad to have it fixed all at once." Then, when she suddenly remembered, and substituted in a tired voice, "Very likely it will, Auntie. It looks like it now, fast enough. Anyway, it's made fuss enough for a whole roof already, and I'm sick of it." With that statement, Pollyanna, her face carefully averted, turned and trailed listlessly out of the room. "It's so funny, and so hard. I'm afraid I'm making a mess of it," she whispered to herself anxiously as she hurried downstairs to the kitchen. Behind her, Aunt Polly, in the bedroom, gazed after her with the eyes that were again faintly puzzled. Aunt Polly had occasion a good many times before 6 o'clock that night to gaze at Pollyanna with surprised and questioning eyes. Nothing was right with Pollyanna. The fire would not burn, the wind blew one particular blind loose 3 times, and still a 3rd leak was discovered in the roof. The mail brought to Pollyanna a letter that made her cry, though no amount of questioning on Aunt Polly's part would persuade her to tell why. Even the dinner went wrong, and innumerable things happened in the afternoon to call out fretful, discouraged remarks. Not until the day was more than half gone did a look of shrewd suspicion suddenly fight for supremacy with the puzzled questioning in Aunt Polly's eyes. If Pollyanna saw this, she made no sign. Certainly there was no abatement in her fretfulness and discontent. Long before 6 o'clock, however, the suspicion in Aunt Polly's eyes became conviction, and drove to ignominious defeat the puzzled questioning. But curiously enough then, a new look came to take its place, a look that was actually a twinkle of amusement. At last, after a particularly doleful complaint on Pollyanna's part, Aunt Polly threw up her hands with a gesture of half-laughing despair. "That'll do! That'll do, child! I'll give up. I'll confess myself beaten at my own game. You can be glad for that, if you like," she finished with a grim smile. "I know, Auntie, but you said," began Pollyanna demurely. "Yes, yes, but I never will again," interrupted Aunt Polly with emphasis. "Mercy, what a day this has been! I never want to live through another like it." She hesitated, flushed a little, then went on with evident difficulty. "Furthermore, I want you to know that I understand I haven't played the game myself very well lately. But after this I'm going to try. Where's my handkerchief?" she finished sharply, fumbling in the folds of her dress. Pollyanna sprang to her feet and crossed instantly to her aunt's side. "Oh, but Aunt Polly, I didn't mean it was a joke," she quavered in quick distress. "I never thought of you taking it that way." "Of course you didn't," snapped Aunt Polly with all asperity of a stern, repressed woman who abhors scenes and sentiment, and who is mortally afraid she'll show that her heart has been touched. "Don't you suppose I know you didn't mean it that way? Do you think if I thought you had been trying to teach me a lesson that I'd But Pollyanna's strong young arms had her in a close embrace, and she could not finish the sentence. Chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 28, Jimmy and Jamie. Pollyanna was not the only one that was finding that winter a hard one. In Boston, Jimmy Pendleton, in spite of his strenuous efforts to occupy his time and thoughts, was discovering that nothing quite erased from his vision a certain pair of laughing blue eyes, and nothing quite obliterated from his memory a certain well-loved, merry voice. Jimmy told himself that if it were not for Mrs. Carew and the fact that he could be of some use to her, life would not be worth the living. Even at Mrs. Carew's it was not all joy, for always there was Jamie, and Jamie brought thoughts of Pollyanna, unhappy thoughts. Being thoroughly convinced that Jamie and Pollyanna cared for each other, and also being equally convinced that he himself was in honor bound to step one side and give the handicapped Jamie full right of way, it never occurred to him to question further. Of Pollyanna he did not like to talk or to hear. He knew that both Jamie and Mrs. Carew heard from her, and when they spoke of her he forced himself to listen in spite of his heartache. But he always changed the subject as soon as possible, and he limited his own letters to her to the briefest and most infrequent epistles possible. For to Jimmy, a Pollyanna that was not his was nothing but a source of pain and wretchedness. He had been so glad when the time came for him to leave Beldingsville and take up his studies again in Boston. To be so near Pollyanna and yet so far from her, he had found to be nothing but torture. In Boston, with all the feverishness of a restless mind that seeks distraction from itself, he had thrown himself into the carrying out of Mrs. Carew's plans for her beloved working girls, and such time as could be spared from his own duties he had devoted to this work, much to Mrs. Carew's delight and gratitude. And so, for Jimmy, the winter had passed and spring had come, a joyous blossoming spring, full of soft breezes, gentle showers, and tender green buds expanding into riotous bloom and fragrance. To Jimmy, however, it was anything but a joyous spring, for in his heart was still nothing but a gloomy winter of discontent. If only they'd settle things and announce the engagement once for all, murmured Jimmy to himself, more and more frequently these days. If only I could know something for sure, I think I could stand it better. Then, one day late in April, he had his wish, a part of it. He learned something for sure. It was 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and Mary, at Mrs. Carew's, had ushered him into the music room with a well-trained, "I'll tell Mrs. Carew you're here, sir. She's expecting you, I think." In the music room Jimmy had found himself brought to a dismayed halt by the sight of Jamie at the piano, his arms outflung upon the rack and his head bowed upon them. Pendleton had half turned to beat a soft retreat, when the man at the piano lifted his head, bringing into view 2 flushed cheeks and a pair of fever-bright eyes. "Why, Carew," stammered Pendleton, aghast, "has anything happened?" "Happened? Happened?" ejaculated the lame youth, flinging out both his hands, in each of which, as Pendleton now saw, was an open letter. "Everything has happened. Wouldn't you think it had if all your life you'd been in prison and suddenly you saw the gates flung wide open? Wouldn't you think it had if all in a minute you could ask the girl you loved to be your wife? Wouldn't you think it had if But listen! You think I'm crazy, but I'm not, though maybe I am after all, crazy with joy. I'd like to tell you, may I? I've got to tell somebody." Pendleton lifted his head. It was as if, unconsciously, he was bracing himself for a blow. He had grown a little white, but his voice was quite steady when he answered. "Sure you may, old fellow. I'd be glad to hear it." Carew, however, had scarcely waited for assent. He was rushing on, still a bit incoherently. "It's not much to you, of course. You have your 2 feet and your freedom. You have your ambitions and your bridges. But to me, it's everything. It's a chance to live a man's life and do a man's work. Perhaps, even if it isn't dams and bridges, it's something. And it's something I've proved now I can do. Listen. In that letter, there is an announcement that a little story of mine has won the first prize, $3,000, in a contest. In that other letter, a big publishing house accepts with flattering enthusiasm my first book manuscript for publication. And they both came today, this morning. Do you wonder I am crazy glad?" No, indeed. I congratulate you, Carew, with all my heart," cried Jimmy warmly. "Thank you. And you may congratulate me. Think what it means to me. Think what it means if, by and by, I can be independent, like a man. Think what it means if I can, some day, make Mrs. Carew proud and glad that she gave the crippled lad a place in her home and heart. Think what it means for me to be able to tell the girl I love that I do love her." Yes, indeed, old boy." Jimmy spoke firmly, though he had grown very white now. "Of course, maybe I ought not to do that last, even now," resumed Jamie, a swift cloud shadowing the shining brightness of his countenance. "I'm still tied to these." He tapped the crutches by his side. "I can't forget, of course, that day in the woods last summer when I saw Pollyanna. I realize that always I'll have to run the chance of seeing the girl I love in danger and not being able to rescue her." "Oh, but Carew," began the other, huskily. Carew lifted a peremptory hand. "I know what you'd say, but don't say it. You can't understand. You aren't tied to 2 sticks. You did the rescuing, not I. It came to me then how it would be, always with me and Sadie. I'd have to stand aside and see others." "Sadie?" cut in Jimmy sharply. "Yes, Sadie Dean. You act surprised. Didn't you know? Haven't you suspected how I felt toward Sadie?" cried Jamie. "Have I kept it so well to myself, then? I tried to, but—" He finished with a faint smile and a half-despairing gesture. "Well, you certainly kept it all right, old fellow, from me, anyhow," cried Jimmy gaily. The color had come back to Jimmy's face in a rich flood, and his eyes had grown suddenly very bright indeed. "So it's Sadie Dean. Good! I congratulate you again. I do, as Nancy says." Jimmy was quite babbling with joy and excitement now, so great and wonderful had been the reaction within him at the discovery that it was Sadie, not Pollyanna, whom Jamie loved. Jamie flushed and shook his head a bit sadly. "No congratulations yet. You see, I haven't spoken to her. But I think she must know. I supposed everybody knew. Pray, whom did you think it was, if not Sadie?" Jimmy hesitated. Then, a little precipitately, he let it out. "Why, I thought of Pollyanna." Jamie smiled and pursed his lips. "Pollyanna's a charming girl, and I love her, but not that way, any more than she does me. Besides, I fancy somebody else would have something to say about that, eh?" Jimmy colored like a happy, conscious boy. "Do you?" he challenged, trying to make his voice properly impersonal. Of course, John Pendleton." "John Pendleton!" Jimmy wheeled sharply. "What about John Pendleton?" queried a new voice, and Mrs. Carew came forward with a smile. Jimmy, around whose ears for the second time within 5 minutes the world had crashed into fragments, barely collected himself enough for a low word of greeting. But Jamie, unabashed, turned with a triumphant air of assurance. "Nothing. Only I just said that I believed John Pendleton would have something to say about Pollyanna's loving anybody but him." "Pollyanna? John Pendleton?" Mrs. Carew sat down suddenly in the chair nearest her. If the two men before her had not been so deeply absorbed in their own affairs, they might have noticed that the smile had vanished from Mrs. Carew's lips, and that an odd look, as of almost fear, had come to her eyes. "Certainly," maintained Jamie. "Were you both blind last summer? Wasn't he with her a lot?" "Why, I thought he was with all of us," murmured Mrs. Carew, a little faintly. "Not as he was with Pollyanna," insisted Jamie. "Besides, have you forgotten that day when we were talking about John Pendleton's marrying, and Pollyanna blushed and stammered, and said finally that he had thought of marrying once? I wondered then if there wasn't something between them. Don't you remember?" "Yes, I think I do, now that you speak of it," murmured Mrs. Carew again. "But I had forgotten it." "Oh, but I can explain that," cut in Jimmy, wetting his dry lips. "John Pendleton did have a love affair once, but it was with Pollyanna's mother." "Pollyanna's mother!" exclaimed two voices in surprise. "Yes, he loved her years ago, but she did not care for him at all, I understand. She had another lover, a minister, and she married him instead, Pollyanna's father." "Oh!" breathed Mrs. Carew, leaning forward suddenly in her chair. "And is that why he's never married?" "Yes," avouched Jimmy. "So you see there's really nothing to that idea at all, that he cares for Pollyanna. It was her mother." "On the contrary, I think it makes a whole lot to the idea," declared Jamie, wagging his head wisely. "I think it makes my case all the stronger. Listen, he once loved the mother. He couldn't have her. What's more absolutely natural than that he should love the daughter now and win her?" "Oh, Jamie, you incorrigible spinner of tales!" reproached Mrs. Carew, with a nervous laugh. "This is no tenpenny novel. It's real life. She's too young for him. He ought to marry a woman, not a girl. That is, if he marries anyone, I mean," she stammeringly corrected, a sudden flood of color in her face. "Perhaps, but what if it happens to be a girl that he loves?" argued Jamie stubbornly. "And really, just stop to think. Have we had a single letter from her that hasn't told of his being there? And you know how he's always talking of Pollyanna in his letters." Mrs. Carew got suddenly to her feet. "Yes, I know," she murmured, with an odd little gesture, as if throwing something distasteful aside. "But " She did not finish her sentence, and a moment later she had left the room. When she came back in 5 minutes, she found, much to her surprise, that Jimmy had gone. "Why, I thought he was going with us on the girls' picnic!" she exclaimed. "So did I," frowned Jamie. "But the first thing I knew he was explaining, or apologizing or something, about unexpectedly having to leave town, and he'd come to tell you he couldn't go with us. Anyhow, the next thing I knew he'd gone. You see," Jamie's eyes were glowing again, "I don't think I knew quite what he did say, anyway. I had something else to think of." And he jubilantly spread before her the 2 letters which all the time he had still kept in his hands. "Oh, Jamie," breathed Mrs. Carew, when she had read the letters through, "how proud I am of you!" Then suddenly her eyes filled with tears at the look of ineffable joy that illumined Jamie's face. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 29, Jimmy and John. It was a very determined, square-jawed young man that alighted at the Beldingsville station late that Saturday night. And it was an even more determined, square-jawed young man that before 10 o'clock the next morning stalked through the Sunday quiet village streets and climbed the hill to the Harrington homestead, catching sight of a loved and familiar flaxen coil of hair on a well-poised little head just disappearing into the summer-house. The young man ignored the conventional front steps and doorbell, crossed the lawn, and strode through the garden paths until he came face to face with the owner of the flaxen coil of hair. "Jimmy!" gasped Pollyanna, falling back with startled eyes. "Why, where did you come from?" "Boston, last night. I had to see you, Pollyanna." To see me?" Pollyanna was plainly fencing for time to regain her composure. Jimmy looked so big and strong and dear there in the door of the summer-house that she feared her eyes had been surprised into a telltale admiration, if not more. "Yes, Pollyanna, I wanted that is, I feared." "Oh, hang it all, Pollyanna, I can't beat about the bush like this. I'll have to come straight to the point. It's just this. I stood aside before, but I won't now. It isn't a case any longer of fairness. He isn't crippled like Jamie. He's got feet and hands and a head like mine. And if he wins, he'll have to win in a fair fight. I've got some rights." Pollyanna stared frankly. "Jimmy Bean Pendleton, whatever in the world are you talking about?" she demanded. The young man laughed shamefacedly. "No wonder you don't know. It wasn't very lucid, was it? But I don't think I've been really lucid myself since yesterday, when I found out from Jamie himself." "Found out from Jamie?" "Yes, it was the prize that started it. You see, he'd just got one, and—" "Oh, I know about that," interrupted Pollyanna eagerly. "And wasn't it splendid? Just think, the first one! $3,000! I wrote him a letter last night. Why, when I saw his name and realized it was Jamie, our Jamie, I was so excited I forgot all about looking for my name. And even when I couldn't find mine at all, and knew that I hadn't got any, I was so excited and pleased for Jamie that I forgot everything else," corrected Pollyanna, throwing a dismayed glance into Jimmy's face and feverishly trying to cover up the partial admission she had made. Jimmy, however, was too intent on his own problem to notice hers. Yes, 'twas fine, of course. I'm glad he got it. But, Pollyanna, it was what he said afterward that I mean. You see, until then I'd thought that he cared, that you cared for each other, and—" "You thought that Jamie and I cared for each other?" exclaimed Pollyanna, into whose face now was stealing a soft, shy color. "Why, Jimmy, it's Sadie Dean. 'Twas always Sadie Dean. He used to talk of her to me by the hour. I think she likes him, too." "Good. I hope she does. But you see, I didn't know. I thought 'twas Jamie and you. And I thought because he was a cripple, you know, that it wouldn't be fair if I stayed around and tried to win you myself." Pollyanna stooped suddenly and picked up a leaf at her feet. When she rose, her face was turned quite away. "A fellow can't can't feel square, you know, running a race with a chap that's handicapped from the start. So I just stayed away and gave him his chance, though it most broke my heart to do it, little girl. It just did. Then yesterday morning I found out, but I found out something else, too. Jamie says there is somebody else in the case. But I can't stand aside for him, Pollyanna. I can't, even in spite of all he's done for me. John Pendleton is a man, and he's got 2 whole feet for the race. He's got to take his chances. If you care for him, if you really care for him. But Pollyanna had turned wild-eyed. John Pendleton? Jimmy, what do you mean? What are you saying about John Pendleton? A great joy transfigured Jim's face. He held out both his hands. Then you don't? You don't. I can see it in your eyes that you don't care. Pollyanna shrank back. She was white and trembling. Jimmy, what do you mean? What do you mean? She begged piteously. I mean, you don't care for Uncle John that way. Don't you understand? Jamie thinks you do care, and that anyway he cares for you. And then I began to see it, that maybe he did. He's always talking about you, and of course there was your mother. Pollyanna gave a low moan and covered her face with her hands. Jimmy came close and laid a caressing arm about her shoulders, but again Pollyanna shrank from him. Pollyanna, little girl, don't! You'll break my heart, he begged. Don't you care for me any? Is it that, and you don't want to tell me? She dropped her hands and faced him. Her eyes had the hunted look of some wild thing at bay. Jimmy, do you think he cares for me that way? She entreated, just above a whisper. Jimmy gave his head an impatient shake. Never mind that, Pollyanna, now. I don't know, of course. How should I? But, dearest, that isn't the question. It's you. If you don't care for him, and if you'll only give me a chance, half a chance to let me make you care for me. He caught her hand and tried to draw her to him. No, no, Jimmy, I mustn't. I can't. With both her little palms she pushed him from her. Pollyanna, you don't mean you do care for him? Jimmy's face whitened. No, no, indeed, not that way, faltered Pollyanna. But don't you see? If he cares for me, I'll have to learn to, some way. Pollyanna! Don't look at me like that, Jimmy. You mean you'd marry him, Pollyanna? Oh, no. I mean, why, yes, I suppose so, she admitted faintly. Pollyanna, you wouldn't. You couldn't, Pollyanna. You're breaking my heart. Pollyanna gave a low sob. Her face was in her hands again. For a moment she sobbed on chokingly. Then with a tragic gesture she lifted her head and looked straight into Jimmy's anguished, reproachful eyes. I know it, she chattered frenziedly. I'm breaking mine, too. But I'll have to do it. I'd break your heart. I'd break mine. But I'd never break his. Jimmy raised his head. His eyes flashed a sudden fire. His whole appearance underwent a swift and marvelous change. With a tender, triumphant cry, he swept Pollyanna into his arms and held her close. Now I know you care for me, he breathed low in her ear. You said it was breaking your heart, too. Do you think I'll give you up now to any man on earth? Ah, dear, you little understand a love like mine, if you think I'd give you up now. Pollyanna, say you love me. Say it with your own dear lips. For one long minute, Pollyanna lay unresisting in the fierce, tender embrace that encircled her. Then, with a sigh that was half content, half renunciation, She began to draw herself away. "Yes, Jimmy, I do love you." Jimmy's arms tightened and would have drawn her back to him, but something in the girl's face forbade. "I love you dearly, but I couldn't ever be happy with you and feel that. Jimmy, don't you see, dear? I'll have to know that I'm free first." "Nonsense, Pollyanna! Of course you're free!" Jimmy's eyes were mutinous again. Pollyanna shook her head. "Not with this hanging over me, Jimmy. Don't you see? It was Mother long ago that broke his heart. My mother. And all these years he's lived a lonely, unloved life in consequence. If now he should come to me and ask me to make that up to him, I'd have to do it, Jimmy. I'd have to. I couldn't refuse. Don't you see?" But Jimmy did not see. He could not see. He would not see, though Pollyanna pleaded and argued long and tearfully. But Pollyanna, too, was obdurate, though so sweetly and heartbrokenly obdurate that Jimmy, in spite of his pain and anger, felt almost like turning comforter. "Jimmy, dear," said Pollyanna at last, "we'll have to wait. That's all I can say now. I hope he doesn't care. And I don't believe he does care. But I've got to know. I've got to be sure. We'll just have to wait a little till we find out, Jimmy. Till we find out." And to this plan Jimmy had to submit, though it was with a most rebellious heart. "All right, little girl. It'll have to be as you say, of course," he despaired. "But surely never before was a man kept waiting for his answer till the girl he loved, and who loved him, found out if the other man wanted her." "I know. But you see, dear, never before had the other man wanted her mother," sighed Pollyanna, her face puckered into an anxious frown. "Very well, I'll go back to Boston, of course," acceded Jimmy, reluctantly. "But you needn't think I've given up, because I haven't. Nor I shan't give up, just so long as I know you really care for me. My little sweetheart," he finished with a look that sent her palpitatingly into retreat, just out of reach of his arms. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 30. John Pendleton Turns the Key. Jimmy went back to Boston that night in a state that was a most tantalizing commingling of happiness, hope, exasperation, and rebellion. Behind him he left a girl who was in a scarcely less enviable frame of mind. For Pollyanna, tremulously happy in the wondrous thought of Jimmy's love for her, was yet so despairingly terrified at the thought of the possible love of John Pendleton that there was not a thrill of joy that did not carry its pang of fear. Fortunately for all concerned, however, this state of affairs was not of long duration. For as it chanced, John Pendleton, in whose unwitting hands lay the key to the situation, in less than a week after Jimmy's hurried visit, turned that key in the lock and opened the door of doubt. It was late Thursday afternoon that John Pendleton called to see Pollyanna. As it happened, he, like Jimmy, saw Pollyanna in the garden and came straight toward her. Pollyanna, looking into his face, felt a sudden sinking of the heart. It's come, she shivered, and involuntarily she turned as if to flee. "Oh, Pollyanna, wait a minute, please," called the man, hastening his steps. "You're just the one I wanted to see. Come, can't we go in here?" he suggested, turning toward the summer house. "I want to speak to you about something." "Why, yes, of course," stammered Pollyanna with forced gaiety. Pollyanna knew that she was blushing, and she particularly wished not to blush just then. It did not help matters any, either, that he should have elected to go into the summer house for his talk. The summer house now to Pollyanna was sacred to certain dear memories of Jimmy. And to think it should be here! Here! She was shuddering frantically, but aloud she said, still gaily, "It's a lovely evening, isn't it?" There was no answer. John Pendleton strode into the summer house and dropped himself into a rustic chair without even waiting for Pollyanna to seat herself, a most unusual proceeding on the part of John Pendleton. Pollyanna, stealing a nervous glance at his face, found it so startlingly like the old, stern, sour visage of her childhood's remembrance that she uttered an involuntary exclamation. Still John Pendleton paid no heed. Still, moodily, he sat wrapped in thought. At last, however, he lifted his head and gazed somberly into Pollyanna's startled eyes. "Pollyanna." "Yes, Mr. Pendleton." "Do you remember the sort of man I was when you first knew me years ago?" "Why, yes, I think so." "Delightfully agreeable specimen of humanity, wasn't I?" In spite of her perturbation, Pollyanna smiled faintly. I liked you, sir." Not until the words were uttered did Pollyanna realize just how they would sound. She strove then frantically to recall or modify them, and had almost added, "That is, I mean, I liked you then," when she stopped just in time. Certainly that would not have helped matters any. She listened then fearfully for John Pendleton's next words. They came almost at once. "I know you did, bless your little heart. And it was that was the saving of me. I wonder, Pollyanna, if I could ever make you realize just what your childish trust and liking did for me." Pollyanna stammered a confused protest, but he brushed it smilingly aside. "Oh, yes, it was. It was you, and no one else." "I wonder if you remember another thing, too," resumed the man, after a moment's silence, during which Pollyanna looked furtively but longingly toward the door. "I wonder if you remember my telling you once that nothing but a woman's hand and a heart, or a child's presence, could make a home?" Pollyanna felt the blood rush to her face. Yes. No, I mean, yes, I remember it," she stuttered. "But I don't think it's always so now. I mean, that is, I'm sure your home now is lovely just as 'tis, and—" "But it's my home I'm talking about, child," interrupted the man impatiently. "Pollyanna, you know the kind of home I once hoped to have, and how those hopes were dashed to the ground. Don't think, dear, I'm blaming your mother. I'm not. She but obeyed her heart, which was right. And she made the wiser choice, anyway, as was proved by the dreary waste I've made of life because of that disappointment. After all, Pollyanna, isn't it strange," added John Pendleton, his voice growing tender, "that it should be the little hand of her own daughter that led me into the path of happiness at last?" Pollyanna moistened her lips convulsively. "Oh, but Mr. Pendleton, I Once again the man brushed aside her protests with a smiling gesture. "Yes, it was, Pollyanna, your little hand in the long ago. You and your glad game." "Oh!" Pollyanna relaxed visibly in her seat. The terror in her eyes began slowly to recede. "And so all these years I've been gradually growing into a different man, Pollyanna. But there's one thing I haven't changed, my dear." He paused, looked away, then turned gravely tender eyes back to her face. "I still think it takes a woman's hand and heart, or a child's presence, to make a home." "Yes, but you've got the child's presence," plunged in Pollyanna, the terror coming back to her eyes. "There's Jimmy, you know." The man gave an amused laugh. "I know, but I don't think even you would say that Jimmy is is exactly a child's presence any longer," he remarked. "No, of course not. Besides, Pollyanna, I've made up my mind. I've got to have the woman's hand and heart." His voice dropped and trembled a little. "Oh, have you?" Pollyanna's fingers met and clutched each other in a spasmodic clasp. John Pendleton, however, seemed neither to hear nor to see. He had leaped to his feet and was nervously pacing up and down the little house. "Pollyanna," he stopped and faced her, if you were I, and were going to ask the woman you love to come and make your old gray pile of stone a home, how would you go to work to do it?" Pollyanna half started from her chair. Her eyes sought the door, this time openly, longingly. "Oh, but Mr. Pendleton, I wouldn't do it at all, she stammered a little wildly. "I'm sure you'd be much happier as you are." The man stared in puzzled surprise, then laughed grimly. "Upon my word, Pollyanna, is it quite so bad as that?" he asked. "But bad?" Pollyanna had the appearance of being poised for flight. "Yes. Is that just your way of trying to soften the blow of saying that you don't think she'd have me anyway?" "Oh, no, indeed. She'd say yes. She'd have to say yes, you know," explained Pollyanna with terrified earnestness. "But I've been thinking I was thinking that if the girl didn't love you, you would really be happier without her, and—" At the look that came into John Pendleton's face, Pollyanna stopped short. "I shouldn't want her if she didn't love me, Pollyanna." "No, I thought not, too." Pollyanna began to look a little less distracted. "Besides, she doesn't happen to be a girl," went on John Pendleton. "She's a mature woman who, presumably, would know her own mind." The man's voice was grave and slightly reproachful. "Oh, oh!" exclaimed Pollyanna, the dawning happiness in her eyes leaping forth in a flash of ineffable joy and relief. "Then you love somebody!" By an almost superhuman effort, Pollyanna choked off the else before it left her delighted lips. "Love somebody? Love somebody? Haven't I just been telling you I did?" laughed John Pendleton, half vexedly. "What I want to know is, can she be made to love me? That's where I was sort of counting on your help, Pollyanna. You see, she's a dear friend of yours." "Is she?" gurgled Pollyanna. "Then she'll just have to love you. We'll make her. Maybe she does anyway, already. Who is she?" There was a long pause before the answer came. "I believe, after all, Pollyanna, I won't. Yes, I will, too. It's can't you guess? Mrs. Carew." "Oh!" breathed Pollyanna with a face of unclouded joy. "How perfectly lovely! I'm so glad, glad, glad!" A long hour later Pollyanna sent Jimmy a letter. It was confused and incoherent, a series of half-completed, illogical, but shyly joyous sentences, out of which Jimmy gathered much. A little from what was written, more from what was left unwritten. After all, did he really need more than this? "Oh, Jimmy, he doesn't love me a bit. It's someone else. I mustn't tell you who it is, but her name isn't Pollyanna." Jimmy had just time to catch the 7 o'clock train for Beldingsville, and he caught it. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 31. After Long Years. Pollyanna was so happy that night after she had sent her letter to Jimmy that she could not quite keep it to herself. Always before going to bed she stepped into her aunt's room to see if anything were needed. Tonight, after the usual questions, she had turned to put out the light when a sudden impulse sent her back to her aunt's bedside. A little breathlessly she dropped on her knees. "Aunt Polly, I'm so happy. I just had to tell someone. I want to tell you. May I?" "Tell me? Tell me what, child? Of course you may tell me. You mean it's good news for me?" "Why, yes, dear. I hope so," blushed Pollyanna. "I hope it will make you glad a little for me, you know. Of course Jimmy will tell you himself all properly some day, but I wanted to tell you first." "Jimmy?" Mrs. Chilton's face changed perceptibly. "Yes, when he asks you for me," stammered Pollyanna, with a radiant flood of color. "Oh, I'm so happy I had to tell you." "Ask me for you? Pollyanna!" Mrs. Chilton pulled herself up in bed. "You don't mean to say there's anything serious between you and Jimmy Bean?" Pollyanna fell back in dismay. "Why, Auntie, I thought you liked Jimmy." "So I do, in his place. But that place isn't the husband of my niece." "Aunt Polly!" Come, child, don't look so shocked. This is all sheer nonsense, and I'm glad I've been able to stop it before it's gone any further." "But, Aunt Polly, it has gone further," quavered Pollyanna. "Why, I already have learned to care for him dearly." "Then you'll have to unlearn it, Pollyanna, for never, never will I give my consent to your marrying Jimmy Bean." "But why, Auntie?" "First and foremost, because we know nothing about him." "Why, Aunt Polly, we've always known him, ever since I was a little girl." "Yes, and what was he? A rough little runaway urchin from an orphan's home." "We know nothing whatever about his people and his pedigree." But I'm not marrying his people and his pedigree." With an impatient groan, Aunt Polly fell back on her pillow. "Pollyanna, you're making me positively ill. My heart is going like a trip hammer. I shan't sleep a wink tonight. Can't you let this thing rest till morning?" Pollyanna was on her feet instantly, her face all contrition. "Why, yes, indeed, of course, Aunt Polly. And tomorrow you'll feel different, I'm sure. I'm sure you will," reiterated the girl, her voice quivering with hope again, as she turned to extinguish the light. But Aunt Polly did not feel different in the morning. If anything, her opposition to the marriage was even more determined. In vain Pollyanna pleaded and argued. In vain she showed how deeply her happiness was concerned. Aunt Polly was obdurate. She would have none of the idea. She sternly admonished Pollyanna as to the possible evils of heredity and warned her of the dangers of marrying into she knew not what sort of family. She even appealed at last to her sense of duty and gratitude toward herself, and reminded Pollyanna of the long years of loving care that had been hers in the home of her aunt, and she begged her piteously not to break her heart by this marriage, as had her mother years before by her marriage. When Jimmy himself, radiant-faced and glowing-eyed, came at 10 o'clock, he was met by a frightened, sob-shaken little Pollyanna that tried ineffectually to hold him back with 2 trembling hands. With whitening cheeks, but with defiantly tendered arms that held her close, he demanded an explanation. "Pollyanna, dearest, what in the world is the meaning of this?" "Oh, Jimmy, Jimmy, why did you come? Why did you come? I was going to write and tell you straight away," moaned Pollyanna. "But you did write me, dear. I got it yesterday afternoon, just in time to catch my train." "No, no, again, I mean. I didn't know then that I couldn't." "Couldn't? Pollyanna!" His eyes flamed into stern wrath. "You don't mean to tell me there's anybody else's love you think you've got to keep me waiting for?" he demanded, holding her at arm's length. "No, no, Jimmy! Don't look at me like that. I can't bear it." "Then what is it? What is it you can't do?" "I can't marry you." "Pollyanna, do you love me?" "Yes, oh, yes." "Then you shall marry me," triumphed Jimmy, his arms enfolding her again. "No, no, Jimmy, you don't understand. It's Aunt Polly," struggled Pollyanna. "Aunt Polly?" "Yes, she won't let me." "Ho!" Jimmy tossed his head with a light laugh. "Ha! We'll fix Aunt Polly. She thinks she's going to lose you. But we'll just remind her that she's going to gain a new nephew," he finished in mock importance. But Pollyanna did not smile. She turned her head hopelessly from side to side. "No, no, Jimmy, you don't understand. She oh, how can I tell you? She objects to you for me." Jimmy's arms relaxed a little. His eyes sobered. "Oh, well, I suppose I can't blame her for that. I'm no wonder, of course," he admitted constrainedly. "Still," he turned loving eyes upon her, "I'll try to make you happy, dear." "Indeed you would. I know you would," protested Pollyanna tearfully. "Then why not give me a chance to try, Pollyanna, even if she doesn't quite approve at first? Maybe, in time, after we were married, we could win her over." "Oh, but I couldn't do that," moaned Pollyanna. "After what she said, I couldn't, without her consent. You see, she's done so much for me, and she's so dependent upon me. She isn't well a bit now, Jimmy, and really lately she's been so loving, and she's been trying so hard to play the game, you know, in spite of all her troubles. And she cried, Jimmy, and begged me not to break her heart as my mother did long ago. And Jimmy, I just couldn't, after all she's done for me." There was a moment's pause. Then, with a vivid red mounting to her forehead, Pollyanna spoke again brokenly. "Jimmy, if you could only tell Aunt Polly something about your father and your people, and—" Jimmy's arms dropped suddenly. He stepped back a little. The color drained from his face. "Is that it?" he asked. "Yes." Pollyanna came nearer and touched his arm timidly. "Don't think it isn't from me, Jimmy. I don't care. Besides, I know that your father and your people were all fine and noble, because you are so fine and noble. But Jimmy, don't look at me like that." But Jimmy, with a low moan, had turned quite away from her. A minute later, with only a few choking words which she could not understand, he had left the house. From the Harrington homestead, Jimmy went straight home and sought out John Pendleton. He found him in the great crimson-hung library where, some years before, Pollyanna had looked fearfully about for the skeleton in John Pendleton's closet. "Uncle John, do you remember that packet Father gave me?" demanded Jimmy. "Why, yes. What's the matter, son?" John Pendleton had given a start of surprise at the sight of Jimmy's face. "That packet has got to be opened, sir." "But the conditions?" "I can't help it. It's got to be. That's all. Will you do it?" "Why, yes, my boy, of course, if you insist. But—" He paused helplessly. "Uncle John, as perhaps you have guessed, I love Pollyanna. I asked her to be my wife, and she consented." The elder man made a delighted exclamation, but the other did not pause or change his sternly intent expression. "She says now she can't marry me. Mrs. Chilton objects. She objects to me." "Objects to you?" John Pendleton's eyes flashed angrily. "Yes. I found out why when Pollyanna begged if I couldn't tell her aunt something about my father and my people." "Shucks! I thought Polly Chilton had more sense. Still, it's just like her, after all. The Harringtons have always been inordinately proud of race and family," snapped John Pendleton. "Well, could you?" "Could I? It was on the end of my tongue to tell Pollyanna that there couldn't have been a better father than mine was. Then suddenly I remembered the packet and what it said, and I was afraid. I didn't dare say a word till I knew what was inside that packet. There's something Dad didn't want me to know till I was 30 years old, when I would be a man grown and could stand anything. See? There's a secret somewhere in our lives. I've got to know that secret, and I've got to know it now." "But, Jimmy, lad, don't look so tragic. It may be a good secret. Perhaps it'll be something you'll like to know." "Perhaps. But if it had been, would he have been apt to keep it from me till I was 30 years old? No, Uncle John, it was something he was trying to save me from till I was old enough to stand it, and not flinch. Understand, I'm not blaming Dad. Whatever it was something he couldn't help, I'll warrant. But what it was I've got to know. Will you get it, please? It's in your safe, I know." John Pendleton rose at once. "I'll get it," he said. 3 minutes later it lay in Jimmy's hand, but Jimmy held it out at once. "I would rather you read it, sir, please, than tell me." "But, Jimmy, Very well." With a decisive gesture, John Pendleton picked up a paper cutter, opened the envelope, and pulled out the contents. There was a package of several papers tied together, and one folded sheet alone, apparently a letter. This John Pendleton opened and read first, and as he read, Jimmy, tense and breathless, watched his face. He saw, therefore, the look of amazement, joy, and something else he could not name, that leaped into John Pendleton's countenance. "Uncle John, what is it? What is it?" he demanded. "Read it for yourself," answered the man. thrusting the letter into Jimmy's outstretched hand. And Jimmy read this: "The enclosed papers are the legal proof that my boy Jimmy is really James Kent, son of John Kent, who married Doris Weatherby, daughter of William Weatherby of Boston. There is also a letter in which I explain to my boy why I have kept him from his mother's family all these years. If this packet is opened by him at 30 years of age, he will read this letter, and I hope will forgive a father who feared to lose his boy entirely, so took this drastic course to keep him to himself. If it is opened by strangers because of his death, I request that his mother's people in Boston be notified at once, and the enclosed package of papers be given intact into their hands. John Kent." Jimmy was pale and shaken when he looked up to meet John Pendleton's eyes. "Am I the lost Jamie?" "The letter says you have documents there to prove it," nodded the other. "Mrs. Carew's nephew?" "Of course." "But why, what? I can't realize it." There was a moment's pause before into Jimmy's face flashed a new joy. "Then surely now I know who I am. I can tell Mrs. Chilton something of my people." "I should say you could," retorted John Pendleton dryly. "The Boston Weatherbys can trace straight back to the Crusades, and I don't know but to the year 1. That ought to satisfy her. As for your father, he came of good stock, too, Mrs. Carew told me, though he was rather eccentric, and not pleasing to the family, as you know, of course." "Yes, poor Dad. And what a life he must have lived with me all those years, always dreading pursuit. I can understand lots of things now that used to puzzle me. A woman called me Jamie once. Jove, how angry he was! I know now why he hurried me away that night without even waiting for supper. Poor Dad! It was right after that he was taken sick. He couldn't use his hands or his feet, and very soon he couldn't talk straight. Something ailed his speech. I remember when he died he was trying to tell me something about this packet. I believe now he was telling me to open it and go to my mother's people, but I thought that he was just telling me to keep it safe, so that's what I promised him. But it didn't comfort him any. It only seemed to worry him more. You see, I didn't understand. Poor Dad!" "Suppose we take a look at these papers," suggested John Pendleton. "Besides, there's a letter from your father to you, I understand. Don't you want to read it?" "Yes, of course. And then—" The young fellow laughed shamefacedly and glanced at the clock. "I was wondering just how soon I could go back to Pollyanna." A thoughtful frown came to John Pendleton's face. He glanced at Jimmy, hesitated, then spoke. "I know you want to see Pollyanna, lad, and I don't blame you. But it strikes me that under the circumstances you should go first to Mrs. Carew and take these." He tapped the papers before him. Jimmy drew his brows together and pondered. "All right, sir, I will," he agreed resignedly. "And if you don't mind, I'd like to go with you," further suggested John Pendleton, a little diffidently. I have a little matter of my own that I'd like to see your aunt about. Suppose we go down today on the 3 o'clock." "Good. We will, sir. Gorry! And so I'm Jamie! I can't grasp it yet," exclaimed the young man, springing to his feet and restlessly moving about the room. "I wonder now—" He stopped and colored boyishly. "Do you think Aunt Ruth will mind very much?" John Pendleton shook his head. A hint of the old somberness came into his eyes. "Hardly, my boy. But I'm thinking of myself. How about it? When you're her boy, where am I coming in?" "You? Do you think anything could put you one side?" scoffed Jimmy fervently. "You needn't worry about that. And she won't mind. She has Jamie, you know, and—" He stopped short, a dawning dismay in his eyes. "By George! Uncle John, I forgot Jamie. This is going to be tough on Jamie." "Yes, I'd thought of that. Still, he's legally adopted, isn't he?" "Oh, yes. It isn't that. It's the fact that he isn't the real Jamie himself, and he with his two poor useless legs. Why, Uncle John, it'll just about kill him. I've heard him talk. I know. Besides, Pollyanna and Mrs. Carew both have told me how he feels, how sure he is, and how happy he is. Great Scott! I can't take away from him this. But what can I do?" "I don't know, my boy. I don't see as there's anything you can do but what you are doing." There was a long silence. Jimmy had resumed his nervous pacing up and down the room. Suddenly he wheeled, his face alight. "There is a way, and I'll do it. I know Mrs. Carew will agree with me. We won't tell. We won't tell anybody but Mrs. Carew herself. And Pollyanna and her aunt. I'll have to tell them," he added defensively. "You certainly will, my boy. As for the rest—" John Pendleton paused doubtfully. "It's nobody's business. But remember, you are making quite a sacrifice in several ways. I want you to weigh it well." "Weigh it? I have weighed it, and there's nothing in it. With Jamie on the other side of the scales, sir, I just couldn't do it, that's all." "I don't blame you, and I think you're right," declared John Pendleton heartily. "Furthermore, I believe Mrs. Carew will agree with you, particularly as she'll know that the real Jamie is found at last." "You know, she's always said she'd seen me somewhere," chuckled Jimmy. "Now, how soon does that train go? I'm ready." "Well, I'm not," laughed John Pendleton. "Luckily for me, it doesn't go for some hours yet, anyhow," he finished, as he got to his feet and left the room. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 32. A New Aladdin. Whatever were John Pendleton's preparations for departure, and they were both varied and hurried, they were done in the open with two exceptions. The exceptions were two letters, one addressed to Pollyanna and one to Mrs. Polly Chilton. These letters, together with careful and minute instructions, were given into the hands of Susan, his housekeeper, to be delivered after they should be gone. But of all this Jimmy knew nothing. The travelers were nearing Boston when John Pendleton said to Jimmy, "My boy, I've got one favor to ask, or rather two. The first is that we say nothing to Mrs. Carew until tomorrow afternoon. The other is that you allow me to go first and be your ambassador, you yourself not appearing on the scene until perhaps, say, 4 o'clock. Are you willing?" "Indeed I am," replied Jimmy promptly. "Not only willing, but delighted. I've been wondering how I was going to break the ice, and I'm glad to have somebody else do it." "Good. Then I'll try to get your aunt on the telephone tomorrow morning and make my appointment." True to his promise, Jimmy did not appear at the Carew mansion until 4 o'clock the next afternoon. Even then he felt suddenly so embarrassed that he walked twice by the house before he summoned sufficient courage to go up the steps and ring the bell. Once in Mrs. Carew's presence, however, he was soon his natural self. So quickly did she set him at his ease, and so tactfully did she handle the situation. To be sure, at the very first there were a few tears, and a few incoherent exclamations. Even John Pendleton had to reach a hasty hand for his handkerchief. But before very long a semblance of normal tranquillity was restored, and only the tender glow in Mrs. Carew's eyes and the ecstatic happiness in Jimmy's and John Pendleton's was left to mark the occasion as something out of the ordinary. "And I think it's so fine of you about Jamie," exclaimed Mrs. Carew after a little. "Indeed, Jimmy, I shall still call you Jimmy for obvious reasons. Besides, I like it better for you. Indeed, I think you're just right, if you're willing to do it. And I'm making some sacrifice myself, too," she went on tearfully, "for I should be so proud to introduce you to the world as my nephew. And indeed, Aunt Ruth, I—" At a half-stifled exclamation from John Pendleton, Jimmy stopped short. He saw then that Jamie and Sadie Dean stood just inside the door. Jamie's face was very white. "Aunt Ruth!" he exclaimed, looking from one to the other with startled eyes. "Aunt Ruth! You don't mean—" All the blood receded from Mrs. Carew's face, and from Jimmy's, too. John Pendleton, however, advanced jauntily. "Yes, Jamie, why not? I was going to tell you soon, anyway, so I'll tell you now." Jimmy gasped and stepped hastily forward, but John Pendleton silenced him with a look. "Just a little while ago Mrs. Carew made me the happiest of men by saying yes to a certain question I asked. Now, as Jimmy calls me Uncle John, why shouldn't he begin right away to call Mrs. Carew Aunt Ruth?" "Oh, oh!" exclaimed Jamie in plain delight, while Jimmy, under John Pendleton's steady gaze, just managed to save the situation by not blurting out his surprise and pleasure. Naturally, too, just then, blushing, Mrs. Carew became the center of everyone's interest, and the danger point was passed. Only Jimmy heard John Pendleton say, low in his ear a bit later, "So you see, you young rascal, I'm not going to lose you after all. We shall both have you now." Exclamations and congratulations were still at their height when Jamie, a new light in his eyes, turned without warning to Sadie Dean. "Sadie, I'm going to tell them now," he declared triumphantly. Then, with the bright color in Sadie's face telling the tender story, even before Jamie's eager lips could frame the words, more congratulations and exclamations were in order, and everybody was laughing and shaking hands with everybody else. Jimmy, however, very soon began to eye them all aggrievedly, longingly. "This is all very well for you," he complained then. "You each have each other, but where do I come in? I can just tell you, though, that if only a certain young lady I know were here, I should have something to tell you, perhaps." "Just a minute, Jimmy," interposed John Pendleton. "Let's play I was Aladdin, and let me rub the lamp. Mrs. Carew, have I your permission to ring for Mary?" "Why, yes, certainly," murmured that lady in a puzzled surprise that found its duplicate on the faces of the others. A few minutes later Mary stood in the doorway. "Did I hear Miss Pollyanna come in a short time ago?" asked John Pendleton. "Yes, sir, she is here." "Won't you ask her to come down, please?" "Pollyanna here!" exclaimed an amazed chorus as Mary disappeared. Jimmy turned very white, then very red. "Yes, I sent a note to her yesterday by my housekeeper. I took the liberty of asking her down for a few days to see you, Mrs. Carew. I thought the little girl needed a rest and a holiday, and my housekeeper has instructions to remain and care for Mrs. Chilton. I also wrote a note to Mrs. Chilton herself," he added, turning suddenly to Jimmy, with unmistakable meaning in his eyes. "And I thought, after she read what I said, that she'd let Pollyanna come. It seems she did, for here she is." And there she was in the doorway, blushing, starry-eyed, yet withal just a bit shy and questioning. "Pollyanna, dearest!" It was Jimmy who sprang forward to meet her, and who, without 1 minute's hesitation, took her in his arms and kissed her. "Oh, Jimmy, before all these people!" breathed Pollyanna in embarrassed protest. "Pooh! I should have kissed you then, Pollyanna, if you'd been straight in the middle of Washington Street itself," vowed Jimmy. "For that matter, look at all these people and see for yourself if you need to worry about them." And Pollyanna looked, and she saw. Over by one window, backs carefully turned, Jamie and Sadie Dean. Over by another window, backs also carefully turned, Mrs. Carew and John Pendleton. Pollyanna smiled so adorably that Jimmy kissed her again. "Oh, Jimmy, isn't it all beautiful and wonderful?" she murmured softly. "And Aunt Polly, she knows everything now, and it's all right. I think it would have been all right anyway. She was beginning to feel so bad for me. Now she's so glad, and I am too. Why, Jimmy, I'm glad, glad, glad for everything now." Jimmy caught his breath with a joy that hurt. "God grant, little girl, that always it may be so with you," he choked unsteadily, his arms holding her close. "I'm sure it will," sighed Pollyanna, with shining eyes of confidence. End of Chapter 32. End of the book Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Read for LibriVox.org by Mary Anderson.